Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever heard your own words betray you? The question hung in the air as I trudged deeper into the Oregon forest, my hiking boots crunching over fallen pine needles. The September air carried the first hints of autumn's chill, wrapping around me like a warning I should have heeded. My name is Michael Thorne, and until 3 days ago, I was researching acoustic anomalies for my doctoral thesis. Now, I'm not sure what I am anymore. Perhaps a witness. Perhaps a victim. Perhaps something in between. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Document the unusual sound patterns in the abandoned chapel nestled deep within the Tillamook forest. Local hikers have reported strange echoes, and my professor thought it would make an excellent case study for my research on architectural acoustics in isolated structures. It's just old wood and empty space playing tricks, Professor Lambert had said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. But the stories are fascinating. Some say the chapel repeats your words differently than you spoke them. The trail narrowed as I ventured further from the marked paths. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in fragmented beams, casting dappled shadows that seemed to move even when the trees stood still. The forest was unnaturally quiet, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Just the sound of my breathing and footsteps, both growing more labored as I climbed higher. I checked my GPS again. The chapel should be just beyond the next ridge, in a small clearing that once served the logging community that had long since abandoned these woods. According to my research, it was built in 1924 and abandoned sometime in the 1960s after a series of unexplained incidents that the local historical society records mentioned only in passing. As I crested the hill, I saw it, a simple wooden structure with a modest steeple, weathered by decades of rain and neglect. Its dark windows stared back at me like empty eye sockets. The chapel wasn't large, perhaps able to seat 30 people in its prime, but its presence dominated the clearing with an authority that made me pause. Something moved in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting between trees. I turned quickly, but saw nothing except the endless columns of pines. Yet the sensation of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of my neck. I approached the chapel slowly, my recording equipment heavy in my backpack. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, each one sounding like a pained exhalation. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar as if recently disturbed. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door open wider. "Anyone here?" The interior was dim, illuminated only by what little light filtered through the grimy windows. Rows of pews faced a simple altar, a cross hanging crookedly on the far wall. Dust particles danced in the shafts of light, and the air smelled of mold and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. And then came the echo. "Here, anyone here?" But the voice that returned my call was not my own. It was higher, almost childlike, with a lilt that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The echo had come from deeper within the chapel, yet the space was small enough that I could see there was no one else present. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice unsteady. Someone's there," came the reply, the words similar but rearranged, the voice now deeper, rougher. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, unusual acoustics, wind through broken boards, my own imagination heightened by isolation. I set my backpack down and removed my recording equipment, determined to capture this phenomenon. This was why I had come, after all. Anomalous acoustics. Nothing more. But as I set up my microphones and sound meters, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the corners of the chapel were growing darker, stretching toward me with deliberate slowness. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and my breath began to fog in front of my face. This is Michael Thorne, conducting acoustic analysis at the abandoned chapel in Tillamook Forest. I spoke clearly into my recorder. The time is 3:42 p.m. on September 12th. Michael, time, abandoned. The echo returned, the words cherry-picked from my introduction and rearranged in a whisper that seemed to circle the room before settling cold against my ear. I nearly dropped my equipment. The echo wasn't following natural laws of sound reflection. It was selective, intelligent in its repetition. Something creaked in the rafters above. I looked up to see a dark stain spreading across the wooden ceiling, not water damage, but something that seemed to pulse and shift as if alive. My hands trembled as I continued setting up my equipment. I told myself this was simply fear playing tricks on my perception. I was alone in an old building with unusual acoustics. Nothing more. But deep down, as the shadows lengthened and the whispers continued to echo my words in increasingly distorted ways, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't alone in that chapel. And whatever was with me was listening, learning, and preparing to speak. The first hour of recordings yielded nothing scientifically conclusive, but everything unsettling. Each time I spoke, the echo returned, my words transformed, sometimes with different inflections, sometimes with words rearranged, and sometimes with additions I never uttered. Testing acoustical properties of the western wall, I announced, moving my equipment closer to the weathered boards. Testing, your presence. Came the reply, the voice now distinctly feminine, with a rasp that suggested a dry and used throat. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. My research depended on this data, and I wasn't about to let an acoustic anomaly, no matter how disturbing, drive me away. I adjusted my equipment, telling myself that there must be a rational explanation. Perhaps the unusual shape of the ceiling was creating some kind of auditory illusion. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Dust motes spiraled in the beams of light, sometimes forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like symbols or letters quickly dissolving before I could interpret them. The chapel was built in 1924 by the Tillamook Logging Company. I spoke into my recorder, reciting the history I had researched. It served as a place of worship for the logging community until the blood, the echo cut in, the words I hadn't spoken coming in a harsh whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls. My skin prickled with gooseflesh. I hadn't said anything about blood. I checked my recorder to ensure it was capturing these anomalies, but the battery indicator was flashing red despite having been fully charged before I entered the chapel. Battery failure on primary recording device, I noted aloud, reaching for my backup. Failure, inevitable. The echo responded. I found myself moving toward the center of the chapel, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The pews seemed to lean inward slightly, as if bending to listen. The cross on the wall had tilted further, now hanging at an angle that defied gravity. As I approached the altar, I noticed small carvings in the wood, symbols I didn't recognize, resembling neither letters nor pictures, but something in between. They seemed recent, the cuts still fresh with no dust settled in their grooves. "Who's been here?" I asked, running my fingers over the strange markings. The echo came not from behind me this time, but directly in my ear, as if someone were standing beside me. We've always been here. I jerked away, spinning around to find nothing. Empty space. Yet the sensation of a presence lingered, like the afterimage of a bright light against closed eyelids. My heart hammered in my chest, and I found myself backing toward the door, suddenly desperate for fresh air. The rational part of my mind was losing ground to primordial fear, the kind that recognizes danger before conscious thought can name it. Outside, the forest had darkened considerably. The sun was setting behind the mountains, and long shadows stretched between the trees like reaching fingers. I sat on the chapel steps, gulping in the cool air, trying to calm my racing pulse. "Get it together, Michael," I muttered to myself. "It's just unusual acoustics. That's why you're here. Why you're here." The echo drifted through the chapel door, which I realized with a jolt was now closed, though I hadn't shut it. My equipment was still inside. I would have to go back in. But not now, not with darkness falling and my nerves frayed. I decided to set up camp nearby and return in the morning when daylight would dispel some of the chapel's oppressive atmosphere. I pitched my tent at the edge of the clearing, just far enough from the chapel to ease my mind, but close enough to keep it in sight. As I prepared a simple dinner on my camping stove, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from the chapel's dark windows. The night descended like a shroud, and with it came an unusual silence. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted. Just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles, sometimes carrying sounds that might have been words if I listened too closely. Inside my tent, I reviewed the notes I'd managed to take. The words from the echo didn't follow any pattern I could discern. They weren't simple repetitions or distortions that could be explained by the chapel's architecture. They seemed responsive, intelligent. I must have dozed off while making notes, because I woke with a start to find my flashlight dimming, the batteries failing just like my recorder had. The darkness pressed in, absolute and smothering. And then I heard it, a soft tapping on the ground outside my tent. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Like footsteps, but too light, too quick. "Who's there?" I called, my voice embarrassingly thin with fear. No echo this time. Just the tapping, circling my tent, growing faster. I fumbled for my phone, its screen casting a weak blue light that did little to comfort me. No signal, of course. I was miles from the nearest cell tower. The tapping stopped directly outside the tent entrance. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of breathing or movement. Silence stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Then, a whisper, not an echo, but a direct address. "Michael, come back inside. We're not finished yet." The voice was familiar now. It held fragments of my own intonation, as if the echo had been learning to speak like me. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat clutching my knife, watching the shadow of the chapel against the starlit sky, waiting for morning and wondering what exactly was waiting for me inside those wooden walls. As dawn broke, casting pale light through the trees, I made a decision. I would retrieve my equipment and leave this place. Some phenomena weren't meant to be studied. Some echoes weren't meant to be heard. But when I emerged from my tent, I found my equipment neatly arranged on the chapel steps, my recorders, my sound meters, my notebooks. Everything I had left inside. And on my primary recorder, the battery indicator showed full charge. The sight of my equipment arranged on the chapel steps froze me in place. Each item was positioned with deliberate precision, my sound meters aligned perfectly parallel to the edge of the step, my notebooks stacked from largest to smallest, my recorders placed in a perfect semicircle. No animal could have done this. no wind, no natural phenomenon. My first instinct was to grab everything and run, to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. But as I approached the steps, I noticed something else. My primary recorder was running, its red light blinking steadily to indicate active recording. I hadn't left it on. With trembling fingers, I picked it up and rewound the tape, then pressed play. Static hiss from the tiny speaker, followed by a sound that raised the hair on my arms, breathing. Not my own, but something labored and wet, as if through fluid. It continued for nearly a minute before a voice spoke, using fragments of my own recorded words stitched together into new sentences. "Michael, we see you, we've waited, you'll help us, speak again." The recording ended with a sound like many voices whispering simultaneously, too jumbled to make out specific words, but carrying an unmistakable tone of anticipation. I nearly dropped the recorder. My mind raced through possible explanations. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, or I was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and suggestion. Or maybe, just maybe, the stories about this place were more than local superstition. The logical part of me, the scientist, the researcher, demanded evidence. If something truly unexplainable was happening here, I needed to document it properly. The rest of me wanted nothing more than to leave everything behind and never return. The scientist won, but not without compromise. I would collect more data, but from outside the chapel. I set up my equipment again, placing microphones at the doorway and windows, connecting them to my recorders and laptop at a safe distance. "This is Michael Thorne, continuing acoustic analysis," I spoke clearly, watching my sound wave patterns display on the screen. "Something is manipulating the echoes in this structure. I'm attempting to document the phenomenon from a safer position." I waited for the echo, but none came. The forest remained silent, the chapel still. Even the birds seemed to avoid flying over this clearing. Minutes stretched into an hour as I monitored my equipment, recording nothing but the occasional creak of settling wood. The chapel seemed to be mocking me, withholding its phenomenon now that I was prepared to document it properly. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, and with it some of my fear. In daylight, my experiences of the previous days seemed exaggerated, products of solitude and an overactive imagination primed by local legends. I decided to risk entering the chapel again, but only briefly, to place a motion-activated camera inside. If anything was moving in there when I wasn't present, I would capture it. The chapel door swung open at my touch, with none of yesterday's resistance. Inside, the dust mote still danced in the sunbeams, and the pews stood in their silent rows. Everything appeared normal, mundane even, in the bright light of day. I quickly set up the camera facing the altar, where I had seen the strange carvings. But as I looked now, the altar was smooth, unmarked wood. I ran my fingers over the surface where I was certain I'd felt fresh cuts just yesterday. "Where are the markings?" I asked aloud, a chill running through me despite the warmth of the day. The echo came then, but different, not a repetition or rearrangement of my words, but a direct answer, "under your skin." I jerked my hand back from the altar as if burned, spinning around to locate the source of the voice. The chapel remained empty, but the quality of light had changed, dimming as if clouds had passed over the sun. The air felt thicker, resistant as I moved toward the door. "What are you?" I demanded, my voice tight with fear. "What are we?" the echo corrected, emphasizing the plural. "We are the forgotten, the left behind, the ones who weren't finished." I backed toward the door, my camera forgotten on its tripod. The shadows in the corners of the chapel seemed to pulse with a life of their own, expanding and contracting like breathing lungs. "What do you want?" My voice had risen an octave, betraying my mounting panic. "Want? To be heard. To be spoken. To be..." The echo trailed off, and in its place came a sound like water dripping onto wood. I looked up to see the dark stain on the ceiling had grown, now spreading down the walls in rivulets that resembled tears or blood. The liquid moved against gravity, flowing upward in places, forming those same strange symbols I had seen carved into the altar. My back hit the door, but it wouldn't budge when I pushed against it. I was trapped inside as the shadows continued to grow, consuming the shafts of sunlight one by one. The air temperature plummeted. My breath fogged before me, and frost began to form on the wooden surfaces. The cross on the wall spun slowly, rotating in place without visible support. "Let me out," I said, my voice barely a whisper now. "Let us in," came the reply, from directly behind me. I whirled, but there was only the door, still firmly closed. My heart pounded so hard I felt lightheaded, my vision narrowing to a tunnel focused solely on escape. I threw myself against the door, once, twice, a third time. On the fourth impact, it gave way suddenly, sending me sprawling onto the chapel steps. I scrambled to my feet, ready to run, only to freeze in confusion. It was night. Somehow, impossibly, hours had passed in what had felt like minutes inside the chapel. Stars glittered overhead, and a waning moon cast silver light on the clearing. My campsite was as I had left it that morning, but my equipment, everything I had set up outside the chapel, was gone. Only my backpack remained by my tent. I turned back to the chapel, and in the moonlight, I saw something that stopped my breath, hundreds of handprints on the outside walls, visible only in the moon's glow. Small handprints, like those of children, pressed into the wood as if trying to push through from the other side. And as I watched, one set of prints moved, sliding across the wall with deliberate purpose. I ran then, leaving my camera behind, grabbing only my backpack before plunging into the forest. I had no headlamp, no trail to follow in the darkness, only blind panic driving me away from that clearing and what waited inside the chapel walls. Branches whipped my face and arms as I ran, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I had no idea if I was heading toward the trail or deeper into the wilderness, and in that moment, I didn't care. Anywhere was better than where I had been. Behind me, faint but growing louder, came the sound of the echo, no longer confined to the chapel, but following me through the trees. "Michael, we're coming with you now." And with dawning horror, I realized it wasn't just my imagination. The echo had become untethered from its source. It had found a new vessel. It had found me. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a massive pine. The forest was pitch black around me, the canopy blocking even the moonlight. I fumbled in my backpack for my spare flashlight, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice before managing to switch it on. The weak beam did little to comfort me, creating more shadows than it dispelled. I had no idea where I was or which direction would lead back to civilization. My phone still showed no signal, and my GPS device was with the equipment I'd abandoned. "Think, Michael," I gasped between ragged breaths. "Get oriented. Find the trail. Find us. Michael." The whisper came not from behind me this time, but from inside my own head. I clapped my hands over my ears, as if that could somehow block a voice that originated from within. "You're not real," I hissed. "You're a hallucination, an auditory illusion created by stress and fear." Laughter rippled through my mind, a sound like dry leaves rustling. If we're not real, why are you running? I forced myself to my feet, determined to keep moving. Standing still felt dangerous, as if whatever had followed me from the chapel might catch up if I remained in one place too long. The forest seemed to shift around me, trees appearing where none had been moments before, forcing me to change direction repeatedly. More than once, I found myself facing back the way I had come, as if the forest itself were conspiring to return me to the chapel. Hours passed this way, wandering in desperate circles while the voice in my head grew stronger, more coherent. It was no longer just echoing my words, it was speaking independently, commenting on my thoughts before I'd fully formed them. "You're thinking about the markings," it observed as my mind flashed back to the symbols on the altar. "You want to understand them." "Get out of my head," I growled, stumbling over a fallen log. "But we've only just arrived," the voice replied, sounding almost amused. "And there's so much room in here. So many empty spaces where doubt lives. So many corners where fear gathers dust." Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the trees, when I finally stumbled upon a marked trail. The relief was so intense I nearly wept. I followed the trail markers downhill, hoping they would lead to the ranger station or at least the main parking area. The voice fell silent as I approached civilization, as if retreating deeper into my mind. By the time I reached my car, parked at a trailhead that felt like it belonged to another lifetime, I had almost convinced myself that the entire experience had been a stress-induced hallucination. Almost. I drove straight to my small apartment near the university, ignoring the speed limits, desperate for the comfort of familiar surroundings. I needed a shower, food, sleep, normal things to ground me back in reality. But as I stood under the hot spray of the shower, I noticed something that stopped my heart, dark lines under my skin, tracing the veins in my forearms and hands. They looked like the same symbols I'd seen in the chapel, now etched beneath my epidermis like a living tattoo. I scrubbed until my skin was raw, but the marks remained, pulsing slightly with each heartbeat. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, dizzy with fear and exhaustion, my reflection in the mirror stopped me cold. My eyes were different, still my color, still my shape, but somehow wrong. The pupils were slightly too large, and they didn't contract properly when I switched on the bright bathroom light. "We see through your eyes now," the voice commented, breaking its silence. "We see so much more than you ever did." I staggered to my bed and collapsed, beyond caring about the water soaking into my sheets from my hastily dried body. Sleep claimed me almost instantly, dragging me down into darkness deeper than any natural slumber. The dreams came then, vivid, horrifying visions of the chapel's history. I saw it being built not by loggers, but by hooded figures working by moonlight. I saw rituals performed at the altar, blood spilled in carefully shaped patterns. I saw people entering the chapel alone and leaving changed, carrying something extra inside them that wasn't there before. And I saw what lived in the walls, entities without proper form, composed of shadow and sound, entities that fed on echoes until they grew strong enough to create their own voices. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat rather than shower water. My clock read 7:32 p.m. I'd slept through the entire day. My apartment was dark, but I could see with unnatural clarity, as if my eyes had adjusted to a different spectrum of light. "You understand now," the voice said, no longer a whisper but a normal speaking tone, as conversational as a roommate asking about my day. "What we are. What you're becoming." "I'm not becoming anything," I said aloud, my voice raspy from sleep and screaming dreams. "This is some kind of infection or parasite. I need medical help." "The doctors can't see us," the voice replied confidently. "They'll think you're having a psychotic episode." They'll medicate you until we're both quiet. I knew it was right. What could I possibly tell a doctor? That I visited a chapel in the woods and brought home an echo that talks to me? That I have mysterious symbols moving under my skin? They had me committed before I finished speaking. Instead, I turned to the only source I thought might help, Professor Lambert, who had sent me to the chapel in the first place. He had to know more than he had told me. The stories he mentioned so dismissively must have contained some truth, some warning I had ignored. I called his office number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to sound calm while conveying the urgency of my situation. Then I called his home, something I'd never done before. A woman answered, his wife, I assumed. Professor Lambert isn't available, she said after I identified myself. Her voice was tight, guarded. He's been in the hospital since yesterday. A sudden illness. A chill ran through me. What kind of illness? The pause before she answered told me everything. The doctors aren't sure, she finally said. He came back from field work and changed. He's not himself. Where was he doing field work? I asked, already knowing the answer. Some chapel in Tillamook Forest, she replied, confirming my fear. He's been obsessed with it for months, kept saying he heard something there that no one else could hear. After I hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, the voice in my head humming a tune I didn't recognize but somehow knew, a hymn that had been sung in that chapel long ago, when it served a very different purpose than simple worship. You should go back, the voice suggested. The transition would be easier there, where we're strongest. I'm not going back, I said firmly, though even as I spoke, I felt a longing to return, as if the chapel were exerting a physical pull on me from miles away. You will, the voice said with absolute certainty. We all do, in the end. That's how we grow. That's how we spread. I spent that night researching, looking for any reference to the chapel that might explain what was happening to me. Most sources merely noted its existence as a historical footnote in the region's logging history. But in an obscure journal from the local historical society, I found a single paragraph that chilled me to my core. The chapel was officially deconsecrated in 1962 after the disappearance of Pastor Thomas Wells. In his final sermon, witnesses reported that Wells spoke with many voices at once and claimed that the walls had begun to speak back. The chapel was scheduled for demolition, but the contractors refused to complete the work after reporting unnatural sounds and a feeling of being watched from inside the wood itself. The structure has remained abandoned since. As I read those words, the marks under my skin pulsed and shifted, forming new patterns that crawled up my arms and across my chest, visible even through my shirt as dark lines connecting like a web. We've been patient, the voice whispered, now joined by others, a chorus of whispers that rose and fell like waves. Waiting in the wood. Waiting in the echoes. And now we're waiting in you. I closed my laptop, my decision made. I had to go back to the chapel, not because the voices wanted me to, but because I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening to me before it was too late, before the thing inside me grew too strong to fight. But as I packed a bag with trembling hands, a small, terrified part of me wondered if it was already too late. If I was merely answering the call of something that had already claimed me as its own. The drive back to Tillamook Forest was a blur of internal conflict. The voice, now voices, argued amongst themselves in my head, some urging me toward the chapel, others warning me away. I couldn't tell which were my own thoughts anymore, where my consciousness ended and theirs began. The symbols beneath my skin had spread to cover most of my body, visible through my clothes as dark lines that shifted and reorganized themselves while I wasn't looking directly at them. I wore long sleeves and gloves despite the warm day, paranoid about someone seeing and questioning. I parked at the same trailhead as before, now painfully familiar. The hike that had taken me hours to navigate in the darkness took only 90 minutes in daylight. My feet seemed to know the way, drawn unerringly toward the chapel clearing as if pulled by an invisible thread. The forest grew quieter as I approached, the natural sounds of wildlife giving way to an oppressive silence. Even the wind seemed to die, leaving the trees unnaturally still. Only my footsteps and ragged breathing disturbed the quiet. Home, the voices sighed as the chapel came into view. We're all coming home. The structure looked different in the afternoon light, older, somehow, the wood darker and more weathered than I remembered. The windows were completely black now, not merely dirty but filled with a darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. My abandoned equipment was gone from the steps, with no sign it had ever been there. Even my tent and camping gear had vanished from where I'd left them in my panic flight. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering. The door hung ajar, swaying slightly though there was no breeze. I want answers, I said aloud, stopping at the foot of the steps. What are you? What have you done to me? The chapel creaked, the sound oddly linguistic, as if the building itself were speaking. From inside came a voice, not an echo this time, but clear and distinct. We are the congregation. I recognized the voice with a shock. Professor Lambert? The door swung open wider, revealing my mentor standing at the altar. But it wasn't truly him. His posture was wrong, too stiff and formal. His eyes were like mine now, the pupils too large, too dark. When he smiled, his face moved in sections, as if controlled by someone who didn't quite understand how facial muscles work together. We are all the congregation, he said, his voice overlaid with others. Those who came before, those who built this place, those who prayed here, those who died here. We are the wood and the nails and the blood soaked into the floor. We are the words spoken into empty air, returning changed. Behind him, I could see shapes forming in the shadows, human-like figures composed of darkness and swirling dust, their features constantly shifting, never quite resolving into recognizable faces. And what am I becoming? I asked, 1 foot on the bottom step, unable to stop my slow advance despite my fear. A vessel, Lambert replied, his smile widening unnaturally. A carrier. A way for us to leave this place, to spread our congregation beyond these walls. For too long we've been bound here, able to reach only those who enter willingly. But times change. Adaptation is necessary. The symbols under my skin burned, writhing like living things trying to escape. I clutched my arm, feeling the raised lines moving beneath my fingers. I don't want this, I said, my voice breaking. I came for answers, not to join whatever you are. But you've already joined, Lambert said, his expression almost pitying now. From the moment you first heard our echo, you were ours. The seeds were planted with that first response, growing with each word we returned to you. Your voice gave us shape, your mind gave us room, your body gives us form. I realized I had climbed the steps without conscious decision, now standing at the threshold of the chapel. Inside, the interior had changed drastically. The pews were gone, the floor inscribed with the same symbols that marked my skin. The walls pulsed gently, like the sides of a great beast breathing. You can still choose, Lambert continued, extending a hand toward me. Join us willingly, become a true vessel, carry us into the world with purpose. Or fight us, and become merely a shell, a puppet we were until it breaks. The shadows behind him solidified, revealing dozens of people standing in a semicircle, men and women of various ages, all with the same dark eyes, all with familiar patterns visible beneath their skin. Some I recognized from old photographs of the logging community. Some wore modern clothes. All watched me with the same expectant expression. "How many?" I whispered. "How many have you taken?" "Not enough," Lambert replied. "Never enough. A congregation must grow or die." The symbols under my skin pulsed in time with those on the floor, resonating like strings of the same instrument. The pain was excruciating now, as if they were trying to tear free of my flesh. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake in returning. There were no answers here that would save me, no understanding that would reverse what had begun. The chapel had lured me back not to explain, but to complete what it had started. With the last shred of my own will, I turned and stumbled down the steps, away from the door, away from Lambert and the shadows that wore human forms. "You cannot leave," Lambert called after me, his voice changing, becoming a chorus of dozens speaking in unison. "We are already inside you." I ran, just as I had before, but this time something was different. The forest no longer seemed to conspire against me, no longer shifted to block my path. Instead, it opened before me, offering clear routes between the trees, as if it wanted me to escape. Not to save me, I realized with growing horror. To let me carry what was inside me further. "Spread us," the voices in my head urged. "Speak us into new places. Let others hear our echo through your voice." I ran until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my vision blurring as the symbols continued to writhe beneath my skin. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, Lambert and the others, standing at the edge of the forest, watching me leave with identical expressions of satisfaction. They had never intended to keep me there. I drove recklessly down the winding forest roads, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The voices had quieted to a murmur, seemingly content now that I was unknowingly serving their purpose. The symbols beneath my skin no longer writhed in pain but pulsed with a steady rhythm, like a second heartbeat. What was I carrying? What was I becoming? The question circled in my mind as I tried desperately to formulate a plan. I couldn't go back to my apartment, to civilization, not with this thing inside me, not if it wanted to spread. But where could I go? What could I do? The answer came with startling clarity. If the chapel was the source, perhaps destroying it would end whatever had taken root inside me. I pulled over at a small gas station miles from the forest, filled my tank, and went inside. The attendant barely glanced at me as I purchased a plastic gas can and filled it too. If he noticed my gloved hands or the unnatural pallor of my skin, he didn't comment. "Planning a bonfire?" he asked idly as he rang up my purchases. "Something like that," I replied, startled by how normal my voice sounded despite the chorus still whispering in my head. "It won't work," the voices said as I drove back toward the forest, the gas can secured in my trunk. "We've moved beyond wood and nails. We live in echo now, in voice, in memory." I ignored them, focused only on my desperate plan. I would burn the chapel to the ground, erase it from existence, and hope that whatever connection had been formed between us would burn with it. Night had fallen by the time I reached the trailhead again. I took only the gas can, a flashlight, and a lighter, leaving everything else behind. The hike was easier in darkness this time, my altered eyes seeing with unnatural clarity in the gloom. The chapel stood silhouetted against the starlit sky, waiting. No light shone from inside, but I knew it wasn't empty. They were all there, Lambert, the shadows wearing human forms, the congregation of echoes. They were waiting for me. I approached from the side, circling to the back of the structure where the weather would look most vulnerable. I unscrewed the cap of the gas can, the sharp scent of fuel cutting through the musty forest air. "We'll just find another home," the voices said, almost amused. "We've survived worse than fire." I hesitated, gas can tilted but not yet pouring. What if they were right? What if burning the chapel only released whatever was trapped there? What if I was playing directly into their plan? As I stood paralyzed by doubt, a hand fell on my shoulder. I spun around, nearly dropping the gas can. A woman stood before me, elderly, her white hair gleaming in the moonlight. Her eyes were clear and normal, her skin unmarked by the symbols that covered mine. "You won't find your answers that way, young man," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Who are you?" I gasped, taking a step back. "Eleanor Rivers. I was the midwife here, before." She gestured at the chapel. "Before they came. You know what's in there? What's happening to me?" I pulled up my sleeve, showing her the shifting patterns beneath my skin. She nodded sadly. "I've seen it before. Many times." "Then help me destroy it," I pleaded, holding up the gas can. Eleanor shook her head. "Fire won't work. Nothing physical will. The chapel is just a vessel, like you're becoming. The real evil is in the words, the sounds. The echoes," I whispered. "Yes. They feed on speech, on sound. They twist what's said and send it back changed, infected. Each echo carries a piece of them into whoever hears it." Her eyes were sorrowful. "That's why most of us who remain in the area don't speak much anymore." My mind raced. "But if they feed on sound, on speech?" Eleanor nodded, understanding my realization. "Silence. Complete silence is the only thing they fear. They can't exist without sound to distort, words to twist." The voices in my head grew louder, agitated, as if trying to drown out Eleanor's words. "She lies. She knows nothing. Burn it all. Run away. But speak, always speak." "They're getting stronger," I said, pressing my hands to my temples. "I can't quiet them." "Not out here," Eleanor agreed. "But inside, in the heart of their power, you might stand a chance." "Inside? You want me to go back in there?" "To the altar, where it all began. Where the first words were twisted." She reached out, her fingertips brushing the symbols on my wrist. "These aren't just random patterns. They're language, their language. The language of broken echoes." The chapel door swung open, light spilling out from inside, although I'd seen no light before. Lambert stood in the doorway, but he looked different now, less human, his skin almost translucent, the symbols visible through his entire body like a glowing skeleton. "Michael," he called, his voice a harmonious blend of dozens of others. "You've come back to us. Again." Eleanor's grip on my arm tightened. "Remember, silence is their weakness. Complete and perfect silence in the heart of their power." Before I could respond, she pushed me toward the chapel, surprisingly strong for her age. The voices in my head reached a fever pitch, screaming, pleading, threatening as I stumbled up the steps. Lambert's inhuman smile widened as I approached. "The final vessel," he said. "The one who will carry us beyond this forest, into universities, into cities. Your voice will be our greatest echo." I stepped past him into the chapel, which had transformed even further. The walls were transparent now, revealing swirling shadows between the beams like living smoke. The floor was a pulsing map of the same symbols that marked my skin. At the center stood the altar, now a pillar of pure darkness that seemed to both absorb and emit light simultaneously. The congregation stood around it in concentric circles, dozens of people connected by threads of shadow that ran from their mouths to the central pillar. They turned as one to watch me enter, their eyes reflecting light like animals in the dark. "Join us," they spoke in perfect unison. "Complete the circle. Become our voice in the world." I approached the altar slowly, fighting the pain as the symbols beneath my skin writhed with increasing violence. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind, not twisted, not distorted, but clear, silence in the heart of their power. Lambert and the congregation closed in behind me, blocking any escape. The air grew thick, hard to breathe, filled with whispers and half-formed words. At the altar, I saw a small book bound in dark leather, open to a page filled with the same symbols that covered my skin. The source. The original words that had been twisted into the first echoes. I reached for it with trembling hands. "Read it," Lambert urged, now directly behind me. "Speak the words aloud and complete your transformation." Instead, I slammed the book shut. The chapel shuddered, the walls creaking in protest. The congregation gasped as one, their shadowy connections to the altar momentarily disrupted. And in that moment of confusion, I made my choice. I opened my mouth as if to speak, drawing the attention of every entity in the room. Lambert leaned closer, eager to hear my voice, to capture it and twist it and use it as their final key. But I didn't speak. Instead, I held my breath, forcing absolute silence from my body. The symbols under my skin burned like fire, trying to force sound from me, trying to create vibrations in my vocal cords, my lungs, my diaphragm. I resisted, focusing every ounce of my will on perfect stillness, perfect silence. The congregation grew agitated, moving closer, their mouths opening and closing without sound, like fish out of water. The shadow threads connecting them to the altar began to fray. "Speak." Lambert's voice had lost its harmonious quality, becoming discordant, desperate. "You must speak." I maintained my silence, even as blood began to trickle from my nose, my ears, my eyes. The symbols were tearing me apart from inside, demanding release through sound. The chapel walls began to crack, splinters of wood floating in the air as if gravity had ceased to function. The congregation's forms flickered like bad television reception, sometimes human, sometimes merely shadow. I felt myself weakening, the need to gasp for air becoming overwhelming. But as my vision began to darken around the edges, I saw the altar starting to collapse in on itself, the pillar of darkness shrinking, compressing. With the last of my strength, I placed my hands on the altar and pushed them into the darkness. Pain beyond anything I'd ever experienced shot through my body as the symbols on my skin were pulled toward the collapsing pillar, stretching my flesh, drawing something out of me. The congregation screamed a million overlapping screams as their shadow connections snapped one by one. Lambert's form dissolved into swirling darkness that was sucked toward the altar. My lungs finally gave out, and I gasped for air, but instead of breathing in, I felt something tear free from inside me, pulled out through my open mouth into the collapsing altar. The chapel imploded with a thunderous silence, a vacuum of sound that pulled at my eardrums until they nearly burst. Then darkness claimed me. I woke to morning light and the smell of damp earth. I lay on the forest floor in a clearing that contained nothing but foundations, old stone blocks arranged in the shape of a small building. No wooden chapel, no altar, no congregation. My skin was unmarked, the symbols gone. My mind was my own again, the voices silenced. Nearby sat Eleanor, watching me with tired eyes. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice rough and my throat raw, as if I'd been screaming for hours. "For now," she replied softly. "They'll find another vessel eventually. Another place to build their chapel of echoes. They always do." "How many times has this happened?" She shrugged. "I've seen it 3 times in my lifetime. Before that, the stories go back to when the first settlers arrived. Before that, the native tribes had legends about a place in these woods where the air would steal your words and give them back wrong." I sat up slowly, wincing at the ache in every muscle. "Why help me? How did you know what to do?" Eleanor's smile was sad. "I lost my husband to them in 1972. He was the one who taught me about their weakness, with his last moments of clarity before they took him completely." She stood, brushing dirt from her clothes. "The chapel will be gone for a while now. A few decades, perhaps. Long enough for people to forget, for news stories to seem like local superstition rather than warnings." "I need to warn others," I said, struggling to my feet. "Document what happened, what they are, how to fight them." "You can try," Eleanor said, already walking away into the trees. "But be careful how you spread the warning." "Why?" She paused, looking back at me with those tired, knowing eyes. "Because they live in words, in voice, in echo. Every description of them gives them shape. Every mention of them creates a space where they might find a foothold. Then how can I warn people?" I called after her. Her answer drifted back to me through the trees, an echo that, for once, returned unchanged. "Very carefully, young man. Very carefully." I stand now at my desk, recording this account. My final academic paper, though I know the university will never accept it. My voice recorder captures each word, preserving them as evidence of what exists in that forest, in that chapel that is both there and not there. I speak these words knowing the risk that in describing them, I might be creating a space for them to return. That this recording might itself become a vessel, my voice their new chapel. But the warning must exist. The echo must be heard, even if it comes back changed. So if you're listening to this recording and you hear something in the background, some whisper or voice that doesn't belong to me, turn it off immediately. Don't listen to the echo. Don't let it speak to you. And if you ever find yourself in the forests of Oregon and come across a small wooden chapel where no chapel should be, walk away. Do not enter. Do not speak. Above all, do not listen for the echo, because it will come back changed. And so will you. Recording ends. Have you ever felt a melody crawl under your skin and nest there, like a parasite feeding on your sanity? I arrived at the Evergreen Artist Residency in Seattle on a particularly gloomy Tuesday in October. Rain pattered against the windows of the converted warehouse, now home to a dozen studios where musicians, painters, and writers could live and create in relative isolation. I'd been awarded a 6-month residency to finish my novel, a dream opportunity one couldn't pass up, despite leaving my comfortable apartment in Portland. The lobby featured exposed brick walls adorned with abstract paintings and black and white photographs of previous residents. The receptionist, a woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes named Margot, handed me a heavy iron key attached to a wooden tag marked Studio 7. "Welcome to Evergreen, Mr. Reynolds," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Your studio is on the 3rd floor. The elevator's temperamental, so I recommend the stairs." I thanked her and hefted my suitcase up the creaking wooden staircase. The hallway on the third floor was dimly lit, with amber wall sconces casting long shadows across the faded floral wallpaper. My studio was at the end of the hall, sandwiched between numbers 6 and 8. Studio 7 was spacious but sparse, a queen-size bed in one corner, a kitchenette in another, a desk by the window overlooking the bay, and a small bathroom. Perfect for someone trying to escape distractions. I unpacked quickly, arranged my laptop and notes on the desk, and decided to explore the building. In the common room on the second floor, I met a few of my fellow residents: Olivia, a painter with turquoise-streaked hair; Marcus, a composer who spoke in hushed tones; and Ellie, a ceramic artist with nervous hands. They welcomed me warmly, but I noticed a strange tension in the air. "Have you met him yet?" Ellie asked, her fingers twisting around each other like restless snakes. "Who?" I asked. The three exchanged glances before Marcus leaned in. "The new guy in Studio 9. Arrived last week. Keeps to himself, but at night." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "At night?" I prompted. "He plays violin," Olivia said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not normal music. It's unsettling." I laughed it off. "Well, we're all artists. Experimentation is part of the process, right?" None of them joined my laughter. Instead, Ellie's eyes darted to the doorway as if afraid someone might be listening. "Jeffrey in Studio 2 had a breakdown 3 days ago," she said. "Complete psychotic episode. They took him away in an ambulance." "And Diane from Studio 11 just disappeared," Marcus added. "Left all her things behind. No one's seen her since Friday." I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine, but dismissed it as new resident jitters. "Coincidences," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard for the first time a violin playing somewhere nearby. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, discordant yet possessing a strange, hypnotic pattern. The notes seemed to bend in ways that shouldn't be physically possible, creating intervals that felt wrong to my ears, like mathematical errors translated into sound. I placed my pillow over my head, but the music penetrated everything. It wasn't particularly loud, yet somehow it bypassed all barriers, seeping directly into my consciousness. The melody repeated, with subtle variations that made my skin crawl. There was something about the precision of each note that felt inhuman, like the player wasn't guided by emotion but by some cold, alien logic. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke with a start at 3:17 according to my bedside clock. The music had stopped, but its echo remained in my mind like an afterimage. My sheets were damp with sweat, and my heart raced as if I'd been running. Outside my window, I noticed a figure standing in the courtyard below, face tilted up toward my window. The street lamp cast enough light for me to make out a tall, thin man holding a violin case. As I watched, he raised his free hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning. Then he walked back inside the building, his movements unnaturally fluid, like water flowing uphill. I took a deep breath and tried to convince myself it was just a fellow artist returning from a late-night session. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The melody still echoed in my head, and behind it lurked a presence, something watching, waiting, assessing. Sleep didn't return that night. I sat at my desk, trying to work on my novel, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself sketching the same pattern over and over, a strange, spiral-like symbol I didn't recognize but couldn't stop drawing. When dawn finally broke, I looked down at dozens of pages covered with the same intricate pattern. I gathered them up and shoved them into my desk drawer, suddenly afraid of what I created. Outside my door, I heard footsteps passing by, light, precise, rhythmic, like someone counting out a complex time signature with each step. The next morning, the residency felt different somehow. The hallways seemed longer, the shadows deeper, the air thicker. I rubbed my eyes, blaming lack of sleep for my disoriented state. In the communal kitchen, I found Olivia making coffee, dark circles under her eyes matching my own. "You heard it too," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded, pouring myself a cup from the pot she'd made. "Does he play every night?" "Not at first," she replied, her hands trembling slightly as she added sugar to her mug. "It started about 2 weeks ago. Just a few minutes each night. Now it's hours." "Have you met him?" I asked. She shook her head. "No one really has. Margot says his name is Dimitri. No last name in the registry." I spent the morning trying to work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that strange melody. I found myself humming fragments of it, then stopping abruptly when I realized what I was doing. There was something infectious about the tune, like it wanted to be remembered, to be spread. That afternoon, I noticed a new sound, gentle tapping from the wall I shared with Studio 6. Curious, I pressed my ear against the plaster. "Hello?" a voice whispered from the other side. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," I replied, feeling strangely clandestine. "I'm James, just moved in yesterday." "Roland," the voice responded. "Be careful with the violin, man. Don't listen too closely." "What do you mean?" "The music changes you. Jeffrey was fine until he started appreciating it. Said he could see the patterns. Then he started cutting symbols into his arms." I pulled away from the wall, my heart racing. This was absurd. It was just music, however strange. It couldn't actually harm someone. Yet the memory of those pages I'd filled with that spiral pattern made my stomach clench. I decided to investigate. Under the pretense of introducing myself to my neighbors, I knocked on the door of Studio 9 that afternoon. No answer. I tried again in the early evening. Still nothing. The door looked the same as all the others, except for a small, almost imperceptible symbol carved into the wood near the handle, the same spiral I'd been drawing. At dinner in the common room, I noticed fewer residents than the day before. Marcus was absent. When I asked about him, Ellie just shook her head. Called his brother this morning, babbling nonsense about frequencies and transcendence. They came and got him an hour ago. "This is insane," I said, pushing my barely touched pasta away. "Has anyone reported this to management? Or the police?" "Reported what?" Roland asked, joining us at the table. He was older than I expected, with a weathered face and alert eyes. "That a resident plays weird music and people are having breakdowns? Artists are unstable by nature. They just say we're cracking under deadline pressure." That night, I stuck earplugs in and took a sleeping pill. It didn't help. The music began at midnight precisely, and somehow I heard it clearly despite my precautions. The melody had evolved, grown more complex, with phrases that seemed to fall back on themselves in impossible ways. I found myself drawn to the window. In the courtyard below, 3 figures stood motionless, faces upturned toward the upper floors. I recognized Ellie among them, her posture unnaturally rigid. The music grew more intense, each note drilling into my consciousness. I felt a strange doubling in my perception, as if I could simultaneously hear the music and see it as geometric patterns hanging in the air. My vision blurred, then sharpened to painful clarity. The walls of my studio seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with the melody. I stumbled to my desk and found myself writing frantically, not words but musical notation, trying to capture the impossible progressions I was hearing. The notes I wrote seemed wrong on the page, like they existed between the lines of the staff, in frequencies humans weren't meant to hear. A knock at my door startled me. I froze, pen still in hand. "James?" It was Roland's voice, but different, strained and mechanical. "You should join us. He wants to meet you. He says you're receptive." I didn't answer. After a minute, footsteps retreated down the hall. The music continued for 3 more hours. When it finally stopped, the silence felt like a physical pressure. I looked down at the pages I'd filled, not musical notation anymore, but line after line of that spiral symbol, growing more elaborate with each iteration. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number. The music reveals what's already inside you. Some minds break. Others transcend. Which are you, James?" I deleted the message and threw my phone across the room. It hit the wall and shattered, the screen going black. In the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked wrong. My pupils were dilated, and when I tilted my head, they seemed to contain the same spiral pattern I'd been drawing. I splashed cold water on my face and told myself it was just exhaustion and stress playing tricks on me. But when I turned off the faucet, I could still hear water dripping, except the sound wasn't water at all. It was single violin notes, plucked rather than bowed, forming a countdown. I backed out of the bathroom and nearly collided with my desk chair. It was turned to face the door, though I was certain I'd left it pushed in under the desk when I got up. On the seat was a small object that hadn't been there before, a rosin block for a violin bow, partially used. Beside it, a folded note written in elegant script. "Every instrument needs proper care to reach its full potential. Even human ones." I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak and settling sound in the old building became sinister, potentially meaningful. I considered leaving, packing my things and abandoning the residency, but something held me back. Curiosity? Pride? Or was it the lingering echo of that music, calling me to stay? By morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. The note and rosin block could have been left by another musician trying to be friendly. The strange text message was probably just Roland or one of the others playing a prank. The common room was empty when I went down for coffee. A newspaper lay open on the table, and a headline caught my eye: "Local musician found catatonic after experimental performance." The article described a Seattle symphony violinist who had collapsed during a private recital, eyes open but unresponsive, fingers still moving as if playing his instrument. The date was from 3 months ago. As I read further, the air in the room seemed to thicken. The lights flickered, dimming momentarily before returning to normal. When I looked up, Margot was standing in the doorway watching me. "Everything all right, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. "Fine," I lied. "Just catching up on local news." She smiled thinly. "Dimitri asked about you this morning. Said he'd love to meet a fellow creator." My pulse quickened. "Did he? And when would be convenient for him?" "He's most active in the evenings," she said, her gaze never leaving mine. "Studio 9, any time after sunset. He's quite looking forward to it." I nodded noncommittally and left the common room as quickly as politeness allowed. Back in my studio, I paced, torn between curiosity and growing dread. I needed to know more before confronting this mysterious violinist directly. I spent the day researching in the residency's small library. Buried in old newsletters and archives, I found scattered mentions of previous incidents, a composer who claimed to have discovered the mathematics of madness before throwing himself from the roof garden, a writer who filled 3,000 pages with the same sentence before disappearing, a cellist who reportedly played until her fingers bled, claiming she could hear the music between the notes. Each incident occurred during the autumn months. Each followed the arrival of a new resident who specialized in stringed instruments. By evening, I knew I wouldn't be sleeping anyway, so I decided to observe the night's performance from a different vantage point. The roof garden provided a view of the entire courtyard and the windows of the surrounding studios. As darkness fell, I positioned myself behind a large planter, out of sight from below but with a clear view of Studio 9's windows. Lights were on inside, but the curtains were drawn. At exactly midnight, they parted slightly. I couldn't see the violinist clearly, just a tall silhouette raising an instrument to its shoulder. But when the music began, I felt it physically, like a hand reaching into my chest and squeezing. The melody was even more complex tonight, with phrases that seemed to respond to my specific thoughts. Below in the courtyard, more residents gathered, their faces upturned, expressions rapt. Ellie was there again, along with Roland and Olivia. They stood perfectly still, arranged in a pattern that, from my elevated perspective, formed that same spiral symbol. The music intensified, and I noticed something disturbing. The violinist's movements were wrong. The bow moved across the strings with impossible fluidity, sometimes appearing to pass through the instrument rather than over it. And the figures seemed to flicker occasionally, like a bad television signal, revealing glimpses of something else beneath the human form. I must have made some sound of alarm, because the music stopped abruptly. The silhouette in the window turned, and though I couldn't see a face, I felt its gaze lock onto me with terrible precision. The courtyard fell silent. As one, the gathered residents turned to look up at my hiding place. I ran. Back in my studio, I shoved a chair against the door handle and sat on my bed, trembling. Outside in the hallway, I heard footsteps, many sets, moving in perfect rhythm, stopping outside my door. James. It was Olivia's voice, but flat and motionless. Come join us. He wants to share his gift with you. You're receptive, Roland added, his voice similarly drained. You can hear the spaces between notes. You can see the true patterns. I remained silent, hoping they'd think I wasn't there. After what seemed like hours, the footsteps retreated. Exhausted, I must have dozed off despite my terror, because I awoke to sunlight streaming through my window. The building was quiet, no footsteps, no voices, no violin. I cautiously opened my door and peered into an empty hallway. The common room was deserted, coffee pot cold. The entire building felt abandoned. In the reception area, Margot's desk was empty, her computer still on, displaying a document with that spiral symbol as its header. I returned to my studio, increasingly unsettled by the silence. My laptop screen came to life without me touching it, opening to a blank document that began to fill with text as I watched. Music is mathematics made audible. The right equations can reshape reality. The right frequencies can reshape consciousness. You understand this, James. I've seen your novel, the patterns you're trying to capture in words. But words are limited. Notes can express the inexpressible. I slammed the laptop closed and backed away. From the wall I shared with Studio 6 came a sound, not tapping this time, but scraping, as if someone was clawing at the plaster. "Help," Roland's voice whispered, barely audible. "He's not human. He's using us to break through." "Break through what?" I called back, pressing my ear to the wall. "Reality," came the faint reply. "We're instruments to him, tuned to specific frequencies. When he plays us all together." The wall beneath my hand grew warm, then hot. I jerked away as a thin crack appeared in the plaster, widening as I watched. Through it seeped not dust or air, but a viscous black substance that moved with purpose, forming that spiral pattern on my wall. I backed toward the door, but stopped when I heard footsteps in the hallway, that same measured, rhythmic pace I now associated with the violinist. A shadow appeared in the gap beneath my door, lingering there. A note slid under the door, written in that same elegant script. "Tonight is our finale. Your presence is required. Some instruments will break. Others will transcend. The choice was always yours." I couldn't stay in my studio after that. The black substance on the wall had formed a perfect spiral, now pulsating slightly as if breathing. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. I grabbed my laptop and phone charger, shoved them into my backpack, and slipped out into the hallway. It was empty, but I could feel eyes on me, watching from behind closed doors, from air vents, from the shadows themselves. The main entrance was locked, not just with the usual electronic keypad, but with heavy chains that hadn't been there before. I rattled them uselessly, then tried to call for help on my newly replaced phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi was down too. With no other options, I headed to the one place I thought might offer answers, Studio 9. The door was ajar when I arrived, swinging open at my hesitant touch. The room within was nothing like my own studio. It was vast, impossibly so, extending far beyond the physical dimensions of the building. The walls were covered with a spiral symbol, drawn in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Instead of furniture, the space was filled with string instruments suspended from the ceiling, violins, cellos, basses, arranged in concentric circles. In the center stood a single chair and music stand. No sign of Dimitri. On the stand lay a folder labeled with my name. Inside was sheet music unlike any I'd seen, notes that overlapped and intersected, extending beyond the staff lines, written in ink that seemed to shift colors as I stared at it. Beautiful, isn't it? I spun around. Margot stood in the doorway, but her demeanor had changed completely. She stood straighter, her formerly kind eyes now cold and calculating. "Where is everyone?" I demanded. "Preparing," she said simply. "Tonight is important. The culmination of months of work." "What are you talking about? Who is Dimitri really?" She smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too numerous, too sharp. "Dimitri is an emissary, a collector of rare instruments. Human consciousness produces unique vibrations, frequencies capable of thinning the barriers between dimensions when properly tuned." My mouth went dry. "The residents are being tuned," she finished. "Some resist the process and break. Others adapt beautifully. You've been particularly receptive, James. Your mind already operates on wavelengths adjacent to what we need." "We?" I backed away, bumping into one of the hanging violins. It swung silently, though it should have made contact with others around it. "Enough questions," Margot said, her voice taking on multiple tones simultaneously, like a chord. Tonight, you'll meet the conductor properly. For now, rest. Conserve your energy." She stepped aside, gesturing for me to leave. I did, hurrying back to the stairwell, intent on finding another exit. But each door I tried was chained, each window unbreakable. The building had become a labyrinth, always extending where they shouldn't, doubling back on themselves in ways that defied architecture. By evening, I found myself back at my own studio, drawn there despite my determination to escape. The black spiral on the wall had grown, now covering most of the surface. The room felt like the inside of an instrument, resonant, hollow, waiting to be played. As sunset faded into twilight, I heard movement in the hallways, residents emerging from their studios, moving in that same measured rhythm. I peered out to see them walking in formation toward the roof garden, faces blank, movements synchronized. Among them were Olivia, Roland, and several others I recognized, all transformed into automaton versions of themselves. I followed at a distance, compelled by a mixture of terror and fascination. The roof garden had changed too. The plants were withered and black, arranged in that spiral pattern. In the center stood a raised platform with a single chair. The residents arranged themselves around the platform, standing equidistant from each other, forming concentric circles. I hung back in the doorway, watching as the last light faded from the sky and stars appeared overhead, too many stars, in patterns I didn't recognize. At midnight precisely, the door to the roof swung open once more and a figure emerged, tall, impossibly thin, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit. It moved with fluid grace, each step precisely measured. In its hands it carried a violin made of some dark material that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. This was Dimitri, or whatever wore the name like an ill-fitting suit. As he crossed to the platform, he passed beneath a lamppost, and I caught a glimpse of his face. What I saw made me bite my tongue to keep from screaming. It wasn't a face at all, but a suggestion of one, features that shifted and rearranged themselves continuously, like smoke given temporary form. He took his seat and raised the violin to where his shoulder should be. The gathered residents straightened further, their bodies tense with anticipation. The bow touched the strings, and reality fractured. The first notes tore through the air like physical forces, bending the light around us. The residents began to sing, not with their voices, but with their entire beings. Each person emitted a distinct tone that harmonized with the violin, creating chords that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal ranges. The sky above us rippled and folded, stars swirling into new configurations, all spirals, all turning inward toward a central point that grew darker with each measure of the hellish symphony. I tried to retreat, to run back down the stairs, but my body wouldn't obey. The music had me now, vibrating through my bones, resonating in my skull. I could feel myself being tuned, subtle adjustments to my nervous system, recalibrations of my brain waves. Dimitri's playing grew more frenzied, his bow moving so quickly it left trails in the air. The residents' bodies began to transform, stretching, thinning, their skin taking on the texture of catgut. Olivia's arms elongated into impossible proportions. Roland's torso opened like the body of a cello, ribs becoming frets. Through my terror, I heard a voice in my head, multilayered, ancient. Your consciousness has an unusual resonance frequency. Rare. Valuable. You will be the keystone in our symphony. With a final, impossible chord, the swirling darkness above collapsed to a single point, then expanded into a vast maw, a doorway between realities. Through it, I glimpsed shapes that defy comprehension, beings of pure vibration and frequency. Something reached through, not a hand, but a pattern of force that wrapped around the transformed residents, drawing them upward like notes rising from a page. One by one they lifted, drifting toward the opening, their bodies now merely instruments in a cosmic orchestra. I felt myself rising too, the connection between mind and body weakening with each passing second. The music had become everything, past, present, future, all compressed into a single, eternal moment of perfect harmony. In my last moment of human awareness, I saw Dimitri's face finally settle into a fixed form, still not human, but now clearly visible. What stared back at me was music given flesh, a being comprised entirely of frozen sound waves, complex patterns stacked and interlocked into a mockery of human features. As I approached the threshold of the opening, I realized why he had chosen this place, these people. Artists already lived partially in other realities, their minds accustomed to transforming abstract concepts into concrete forms. We were already halfway to where he needed us to be. The last thing I heard before consciousness dissolved was the final note of his composition, a sound that contained all possible sounds, including silence. I awoke in a hospital bed, blinking against harsh fluorescent lights. A steady beeping from nearby machines marked time with mechanical precision. How long had I been here? Hours? Days? A nurse noticed my movement and approached, her face showing professional concern. "Welcome back, Mr. Reynolds. You've been unconscious for almost a week." My throat felt raw when I tried to speak. "What happened?" "You were found on this tree outside the Evergreen Artist's residency," she explained, checking my vitals. "Severe dehydration, exhaustion. You were in a catatonic state." "The others," I croaked. "The residents?" Her expression darkened slightly. "I'm afraid you're the only one they found. The police are still investigating." A doctor arrived, clipboard in hand, asking routine questions to assess my mental state. I answered automatically, careful to avoid mentioning anything about Dimitri, the music, or the transformations I'd witnessed. Such talk would only extend my stay in the psychiatric ward they'd undoubtedly placed me in. 3 days later, they released me with a diagnosis of extreme exhaustion leading to hallucinations and temporary psychosis. I didn't argue. The truth was far more dangerous than being labeled mentally unstable. I collected my few recovered possessions, my phone, wallet, and laptop, and checked into a downtown hotel, unwilling to return to my apartment in Portland just yet. I needed answers. The next morning, I stood across the street from the Evergreen Artist's residency. It looked normal, no police tape, no signs of the horror I'd experienced. People entered and exited casually. A new banner hung beside the entrance, applications now open for spring residency program. Gathering my courage, I crossed the street and entered the lobby. A young man sat at the reception desk, not Margot. Relief washed over me until he looked up and smiled. "Can I help you?" he asked in a voice with familiar undertones, multiple frequencies layered beneath the main pitch. I backed away. "Just looking for information." "We have brochures right here," he said, his smile never wavering as he held one out to me. I took it reflexively and hurried outside, my heart pounding. In the safety of my hotel room, I examined the brochure. Everything looked professional, ordinary, until I noticed a background pattern in the design, cells spirals, nested within larger spirals. My laptop powered on by itself that night, screen illuminating the darkened room. A blank document opened, and text appeared one character at a time. "The concert isn't over, James. You escaped the performance, but not the composition. Your frequency has been altered. You're still part of the symphony." I slammed the laptop closed and threw it across the room, where it shattered against the wall. But the damage didn't matter. My phone screen lit up next, displaying the same message. In a panic, I fled the hotel, leaving everything behind. I drove aimlessly for hours, eventually finding myself in a small coastal town miles from Seattle. I paid cash for a room in a rundown motel and collapsed into uneasy sleep. The dream was vivid. I stood on that roof garden again, but now I was the one on the platform, violin in hand. The residents circled around me, their transformed bodies still recognizable. Olivia's elongated arms, Roland's hollow chest, Ellie's fingers fused into frets. They watched me with hungry anticipation. I woke gasping, tears streaming down my face. On the nightstand beside me sat a violin case that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside lay a violin made of some dark material that absorbed light. The strings weren't kakka or steel, but something that pulsed slightly, like veins. A note was tucked beside it, written in that elegant, familiar script. Every orchestra needs a conductor. Every doorway needs a guardian. You've been chosen for both roles. I closed the case and drove to the beach, intent on throwing it into the ocean. Standing at the water's edge, case in hand, I hesitated. The case had begun to emit a faint hum, that same melody that had first captivated me at Evergreen. I found myself opening it again, taking out the violin, raising it to my shoulder. My fingers knew exactly where to position themselves on the neck. The bow, when had I removed the bow, hovered over the strings. Out on the water, mist gathered, swirling into that familiar spiral pattern. Within it, shapes moved, the missing residents transformed into something new, waiting for my signal to return. I understood then what had happened. Dimitri hadn't failed, he'd succeeded. The doorway had opened, the transformation had occurred. But instead of being consumed by it, I'd somehow become its inheritor. The mantle had passed to me. The violin felt warm against my neck, alive in a way no instrument should be. One note, that's all it would take to call them back, to continue what Dimitri had started. My bow touched the strings. The Seattle Times ran a small article 3 weeks later about a series of disappearances in a coastal town. Locals reported hearing strange violin music at night. Some claimed to have seen figures gathering on the beach, arranging themselves in spiral patterns. Authorities investigated an abandoned motel room where they found hundreds of pages covered with musical notation experts declared impossible to play on conventional instruments. The occupant, identified as James Reynolds, was never found. At the newly reopened Evergreen Artists Residency, a fresh batch of residents arrived for the winter session. Among them was a tall, thin violinist who kept to himself but played the most haunting melodies at night. The other artists found themselves drawn to the music despite its strangeness, feeling compelled to listen more closely each time. In Studio 7, a faint spiral pattern began to form on the wall, a pattern that grew slightly larger with each passing night. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried beneath our feet? I never should have moved to Eastwick. The small Pennsylvania town seemed perfect on paper, historic architecture, affordable rent, and just enough distance from Philadelphia to escape the chaos while remaining within commuting distance. The real estate agent had called it quaint and rich with history. What she failed to mention was that some of history refuses to rest. My apartment sat on the edge of the historic district, where several blocks of original cobblestone streets remain preserved from the 18th century. During my first tour of the place, I found the stone streets charming, a picturesque reminder of simpler times. The late afternoon sunlight had cast a golden glow across the uneven stones, making them appear almost like scattered coins. These cobblestones have been here since before the revolution, the agent had said proudly, tapping her heel against one. The town council fights every decade or so about replacing them, but the historical society always wins. Now, 3 weeks after moving in, I understood why replacement had been considered. At night, the stones created a particular acoustic chamber beneath my second-floor windows. Every car that passed sounded twice as loud, their tires creating a hollow rumbling that echoed between the narrow row houses. Tonight was my 4th consecutive night of insomnia. The digital clock on my bedside table showed 3:17 in the morning, and I lay awake staring at the shadows on my ceiling. The streetlight outside cast strange patterns through the curtains, patterns that seemed to sway slightly despite the absence of any breeze. A light rain had started around midnight, making the cobblestones glisten under the amber glow of the antique-style street lamps. I'd been listening to the occasional car pass, their tires making that distinct wood slapping sound against the stones. But it had been at least 40 minutes since the last vehicle had passed, which is why the sudden sound of something moving along the street made me sit upright in bed. It wasn't the familiar sound of rubber tires. This was different, a rhythmic clacking that seemed to echo with purposeful precision. Clack, 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 clack. A pattern of 4, then a pause, then another pattern of 4. I slid out of bed and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer down onto the empty street. The rain had intensified slightly, creating a misty halo around each street lamp. The cobblestones glistened like wet scales. But there was nothing there. And yet the sound continued. Clack, 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 clack. Clack, 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 clack. My breath fogged the window glass as I pressed closer, straining to see into the patches of darkness between the pools of lamplight. The sound grew louder, more insistent. It was almost beneath my window now, and with it came another sound, a low, whistling sound that might have been the wind, except that it rose and fell with unsettling regularity, almost like a whinny. A horse's whinny. I jerked back from the window as goosebumps erupted across my arms. There were no horses in downtown Eastwick. It was impossible. But the clacking continued directly below my window, and now I could hear the creak of wooden wheels and what sounded like the jingle of metal harnesses. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to look again. The street remained empty. Completely, utterly empty. The sounds moved past my building, continuing down the street. Clack, 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 clack. I watched in disbelief as small splashes appeared on the cobblestones, splashes from invisible hooves striking the wet stones. The rain parted around something that wasn't there, creating a tunnel-like effect in the falling drops. I backed away from the window, my calves hitting the edge of my bed. My mouth had gone dry, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I told myself it was a trick of the light, of the rain, of my sleep-deprived mind. But deep down, I knew better. Something had just passed beneath my window, something I could hear but not see. And somehow, that was far more terrifying than any visible threat could have been. As the sounds faded into the distance, I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to exhale slowly, then breathe in again. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations, an echo from another street, a peculiar acoustic phenomenon, my own exhaustion creating auditory hallucinations. Yet none of these explanations could account for the splashes I had seen disturbing the rainwater, moving in perfect rhythm with those phantom sounds. I didn't sleep at all that night. And as I watched the first gray light of dawn slowly illuminate the cobblestones outside my window, I couldn't shake the feeling that Eastwick had much more history to reveal to me, history that refused to remain silently in the past. The following day, I moved through a fog of exhaustion. My coworkers at the local library commented on the dark circles under my eyes, but I brushed off their concerns with vague mentions of still adjusting to the new place. How could I possibly explain what I'd heard? What I thought I'd seen? They'd think I was losing my mind, a possibility I wasn't entirely ready to dismiss myself. During my lunch break, I found myself drawn to the local history section. Eastwick had been founded in 1742, originally as a trading post that eventually grew into a small but prosperous town. I flipped through books about the Revolutionary War, the town's role in the Underground Railroad, and its economic peak during the Industrial Revolution. That's when I found it, a small paragraph in a dusty volume titled Eastwick, Legends and Lore that made my blood run cold. Local legend speaks of the midnight coachman said to haunt the cobblestone streets of Old Town. According to folklore, the spectral coach appears on rainy nights, its phantom horses heard but never seen. The legend dates back to 1776, when a loyalist messenger was ambushed while carrying dispatches to British troops. His body was found, but his coach and horses mysteriously disappeared. Some claim the messenger still rides, eternally trying to complete his final journey. My hands trembled as I closed the book. Coincidence, I told myself. Just an old legend that my subconscious had somehow dredged up and manifested during my half-awake state. But as I walked home that evening, the cobblestones beneath my feet seemed different, no longer quaint historical artifacts, but silent witnesses to centuries of history. History that might not be as dormant as we'd like to believe. I found myself stopping in front of the town's small historical society, housed in a federal-style building just off the main square. A middle-aged woman with silver-streaked hair looked up as I entered, her glasses perched low on her nose. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she wasn't asked that question often. "I'm researching local legends," I said, trying to sound casual. "Specifically about the cobblestone streets. I live on Walnut Street and thought I heard something unusual last night." Her expression changed subtly, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pursing of her lips. "New to town, aren't you?" When I nodded, she sighed and removed her glasses. "Those streets have been there for nearly 300 years, she said carefully. "Some say they remember things." "Remember? Like the midnight coachman?" I asked. The woman, Margaret Holden, according to her nameplate, studied me for a long moment before responding. "You heard it, then." "The carriage." It wasn't a question. "I thought I did," I admitted. "But I didn't see anything." "You wouldn't," she said simply. "No one does." She stood and moved to a filing cabinet in the corner. "It's been a particularly active year. You're the fourth person to come in asking since January." She pulled out a folder and laid several photocopied pages on the desk between us. They were accounts from various periods, some typed, others in faded handwriting, all describing the same phenomenon, the sounds of horses and carriage wheels on cobblestones, always at night, always invisible, most often during or after rain. "The earliest written account we have is from 1815, Margaret explained. "A doctor wrote about it in his journal. But the oral tradition goes back much further." "Is there an explanation?" I asked, my throat dry. "Some kind of acoustic phenomenon, maybe?" She gave me a look that was almost pitying. "That's what the university people said when they came with their equipment in 1972. They recorded the sounds but couldn't explain them. Left town rather quickly, as I recall. Outside, the daylight was fading, and I suddenly realized I didn't want to walk home in the dark." Margaret seemed to sense my unease. "It's not dangerous, if that's what you're worried about," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. At least, there's never been any report of the carriage harming anyone. But what? People who become obsessed with it don't tend to stay in Eastwick long. They either leave town or... She hesitated. Or what? I pressed. Or they change. Become withdrawn. Start spending their nights out walking the cobblestone streets. She gathered the papers and returned them to the folder. My advice? Get some earplugs. Or move to one of the newer developments on the west side. I left the Historical Society with more questions than answers, and the distinct feeling that Margaret had been holding something back. As I walked home, each step on the cobblestones seemed to echo with unusual clarity in the gathering dusk. A cold drizzle had started to fall, and I quickened my pace. The streets were almost empty. An elderly man walking his dog crossed to the other side when he saw me coming. He hurried away, casting a nervous glance over his shoulder, not at me, I realized, but at the stretch of cobblestone street behind me. I spun around, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing there. Just wet stones glistening under streetlights that had begun to flicker on as darkness descended. By the time I reached my apartment, my nerves were afraid to breaking point. I locked the door behind me, then checked it twice more before putting on a kettle for tea. The whistle of the kettle made me jump, and I laughed nervously at my own reaction. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. It's just an old story. But as night fell completely and rain began to patter more insistently against my windows, I found myself straining to listen for sounds from the street below. The digital clock on my microwave read 11:43 when I finally forced myself to go to bed, exhaustion overcoming my anxiety. Sleep came surprisingly quickly, pulling me down into darkness, until the sound of hooves on cobblestones jolted me awake at exactly 3:17 in the morning. Clack, 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 clack. I was already at the window before I was fully awake, muscle memory guiding me through the darkness of my bedroom. The rain had intensified into a steady downpour, reducing visibility to just a few yards beyond my window. The street lamps created isolated islands of sickly yellow light in a sea of darkness and rain. Clack, 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 clack. The sound was approaching from the east, just as it had the night before. My fingers gripped the windowsill so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to retreat back to my bed, to pull the covers over my head like a child hiding from monsters. But a stronger, more insistent part needed to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. That's when I noticed I wasn't alone at my vigil. Across the street, in a second-floor window that mirrored my own, a pale face watched. An elderly man, his features barely visible in the dim light, stood motionless behind his own curtain. Our eyes met briefly across the rainy void between our buildings. He didn't nod or wave or give any acknowledgement, but I knew he was waiting for the same thing I was. The sounds grew closer. Now I could make out the distinct rhythm of multiple hooves, for horses, perhaps. The creaking of wooden wheels followed, along with the jingle of what might have been harnesses or bridles. And beneath it all, a new sound I hadn't noticed before, a low, continuous groan, like wood under tremendous strain. Then it appeared, or rather, it didn't appear. Just as the night before, the street remained empty even as splashes formed on the wet cobblestones. But tonight, with the heavier rain, the effect was more pronounced. I could see the outline of something parting the raindrops, creating a horse-shaped void in the falling water. Four of these shapes moved in perfect formation, pulling behind them a larger rectangular void. A carriage, invisible but undeniably there, displacing the rain as it passed directly beneath my window. The whinnying sound came again, louder this time, almost desperate. It was followed by something new, a crack that might have been a whip, and then a voice. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, commanding. A human voice, yet somehow wrong, hollow, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. My breath caught in my throat as the invisible procession halted directly below. The horses, or whatever they were, stomped and snorted, their unseeable hooves striking the cobblestones with increasing agitation. The voice came again, clear this time, but still incomprehensible. It didn't sound like any language I recognized, yet it carried the unmistakable cadence of speech. Someone, something, was giving orders to phantoms beneath my window. I glanced across to the elderly man's window. He had pressed himself against the glass now, his eyes wide with what might have been fear or excitement. He raised a trembling hand and pointed downward, mouthing words I couldn't understand. Then he did something that chilled me to my core. He raised his finger to his lips in the universal gesture for silence, then pointed directly at me. Don't make a sound, his actions seemed to say. It will hear you. As if in response to my thought, the invisible activity below suddenly ceased. The horses stopped their stomping. The voice fell silent. Even the rain seemed to pause for a breath. A sensation of cold dread washed over me as I realized something had changed. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed in return. Something down there had become aware of my presence. I took an involuntary step back from the window, but it was too late. The damage was done. I felt rather than heard attention shifting upward, focusing on my window with terrible intensity. The seconds stretched into an eternity as I stood frozen, barely breathing. Then, with a suddenness that made me gasp, there came a violent crash from the street below, the sound of wood splintering and metal twisting. The invisible horses whinnied in panic, their hooves striking the cobblestones with frantic energy. The elderly man across the street had vanished from his window. I forced myself to look down again. The rain was being disturbed not by orderly movement now, but by chaotic thrashing. The invisible carriage appeared to have overturned, the horses in disarray. And in the midst of this spectral commotion, something new was happening. The cobblestones directly below my window began to glow with a faint, bluish light. At first just one stone, then two, then a dozen, until a rough circle of illuminated stones pulsed beneath me. Within this circle, the rain evaporated before it could touch the ground, creating a dry spot amid the downpour. The voice returned, no longer giving commands, but wailing in what could only be described as anguish. It rose in pitch and volume until it became almost unbearable, forcing me to cover my ears. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the glow faded. The rain resumed its normal pattern, falling unimpeded onto the cobblestones. The sounds of the horses and carriage receded, moving westward down the street until they faded entirely. I stood shaking by my window for several minutes, my mind struggling to process what I just witnessed. When I finally gathered the courage to look across the street again, the elderly man had returned to his window. He was writing something on a piece of paper, which he then held up to the glass. Despite the distance and rain, I could make out 3 words: "They know you." Before I could respond, he dropped the paper and drew his curtains closed. The street was once again just a normal, rain-soaked row of cobblestones. But I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be normal again. I didn't return to bed. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with all the lights on, drinking cup after cup of coffee as I waited for dawn. My laptop sat open before me, dozens of tabs documenting Eastwick's history, legends about phantom carriages, and theories about residual hauntings. One historical account particularly caught my attention, a newspaper article from 1872 describing a strange incident where a section of cobblestone street had been found unnaturally warm to the touch and emitting a peculiar glow following reports of spectral sounds in the night. The affected stones had been replaced, but similar incidents had occurred every few decades since. As the first gray light of morning finally appeared, I made a decision. After calling in sick to work, I grabbed my raincoat and headed out into the damp, early morning streets. I needed to see those cobblestones in daylight. I needed to know if there was any physical evidence of what had transpired. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. The cobblestones looked different in the pale morning light. What had appeared uniform in darkness now revealed itself as a patchwork, different stones from different periods, their colors and textures subtle testaments to centuries of repairs and replacements. I stood on the sidewalk, staring down at the spot where the invisible carriage had overturned. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss. The street was wet from the night's rain, puddles gathered in the low spots between stones. A perfectly ordinary sight. But as I knelt down for a closer look, my breath caught. There, in a rough circle exactly where the blue glow had appeared, the cobblestones were dry. Completely dry, despite the surrounding dampness. I reached out a hesitant hand to touch one of these stones and jerked back immediately. It was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air around it, as if it had been sitting in the sun on a summer day rather than exposed to a cold spring rain. "You shouldn't touch them," a voice said behind me. I spun around to find the elderly man from the window standing a few feet away. In daylight, he looked frownier than I'd expected, thin and stooped, with wispy white hair and watery blue eyes that seemed too large for his face. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane with a brass handle worn smooth by years of use. "Who are you?" I asked. "Thomas Wheatley," he replied, his voice as thin and reedy as his frame. "I've lived on this street for 67 years. He gestured toward the stones with his cane. "And I've been watching them almost as long. What happened last night? What did I see?" Thomas glanced up and down the empty street before answering. "Not here," he said quietly. "They listened through the stones." A chill ran down my spine despite the absurdity of his statement. "Who listens?" "The ones who don't belong to our time anymore." He turned and began walking slowly away, his cane tapping a rhythm against the sidewalk. After a few steps, he paused and looked back. "Are you coming?" I hesitated only briefly before following him. As we walked, I noticed how carefully Thomas avoided stepping on the cobblestones themselves, keeping strictly to the concrete sidewalk. I found myself doing the same. He led me to a small coffee shop 3 blocks away, in a newer part of town where asphalt had replaced the historic stones. Only when we were seated in a back corner, mugs of steaming coffee between us, did he speak again. "You've been marked," he said without preamble. "Just like I was, back in 1978. Just like Dorothy Miller in 94. And poor Jack Templeton in 2007. Marked? By what? By whom, you mean?" Thomas took a sip of his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. "The coachman doesn't like being watched. Most nights, he just goes about his business, riding the same route he took in life, over and over again. A ghost that doesn't know it's dead, some would say. But sometimes, rarely, he notices us noticing him. And that's when the trouble starts." My mouth had gone dry. "What kind of trouble?" Thomas's eyes took on a distant look. "Dorothy moved away after 3 months of nightmares so bad she became afraid to sleep. Jack wasn't so lucky. They found him wandering the cobblestone streets at 4 in the morning in December, barefoot and raving about horses calling his name. He spent 6 months in psychiatric care. And you? I asked quietly. What happened to you? A sad smile crossed his withered face. I'm still here, aren't I? 47 years later. He leaned forward. But I learned how to manage it. How to live with the knowledge. Knowledge of what, exactly? That the past isn't really past. That time isn't the straight line we think it is. He tapped his temple with a gnarled finger. Once you've seen the coachman, you start to see other things too. The barriers between then and now become porous. I thought about the blue glow, the warm stones. What were those glowing cobblestones? Why did the carriage overturn? Thomas frowned. That's new. I've never seen the stones glow like that before. The carriage has never crashed in all my years of watching. He studied my face intently. What exactly did you do when you saw it? Nothing. I just stood at my window. I saw you across the street. You must have done something, he insisted. Said something, perhaps? I tried to remember the exact sequence of events. I didn't speak. But I think I gasped when I felt it notice me. Thomas went very still. You felt it? Describe the feeling. Like being watched. Like something cold suddenly focusing on me. I shivered at the memory. And then it crashed. He sat back, his expression grave. The coachman has never acknowledged anyone before. He rides his route, trapped in his own time, unaware of ours. If he noticed you, truly noticed you, then something has changed. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The barrier is thinning. What barrier? Between their time and ours. Thomas glanced nervously at the windows of the coffee shop, as if expecting to see something watching us. Listen to me very carefully. You need to stay away from those cobblestones at night. Especially at 3:17. The specific time made me start. Why that exact time? I don't know. It's always been 3:17 when the carriage appears. Some historical significance, perhaps. He reached across the table and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. Promise me you'll stay away. I promised, more to relieve the increasing pressure of his bony fingers than out of any real conviction. Thomas seemed to sense my insincerity. You won't, though. I can see it in your eyes. The curiosity. The need to understand. He released my wrist and slumped back in his chair. That's how it starts for all of us. All of who? The Watchers. That's what Dorothy called us. Those who've been marked and can't look away. He sighed deeply. There aren't many of us left now. Just me, as far as I know. Until you. We parted ways shortly after, Thomas extracting one more promise for me to stay away from the cobblestones at night. A promise I had no intention of keeping. That evening, I prepared. I set up a video camera on a tripod, aiming it down at the street from my window. I positioned an audio recorder nearby. I even drew the curtains and closed them with binder clips to ensure they wouldn't move and reveal my presence. At 3:15, I stood back from the window, watching the feed from my camera on my laptop screen. The street was empty, glistening under the street lamps, though the rain had stopped hours ago. 3:16 came and went. At 3:17 exactly, my equipment failed. The camera's feed went to static. The audio recorder emitted a high-pitched squeal that quickly escalated beyond the range of human hearing, causing the small hairs on my arms to stand on end. And despite my precautions, despite the tightly clipped curtains, a cold draft swept through my apartment, extinguishing the single candle I'd lit and plunging me into darkness. In that moment of blind panic, I heard it, not from outside on the street, but impossibly, terrifyingly, from inside my apartment. Clack, 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 clack. The sound of hooves on cobblestones. Coming from my kitchen. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I lunged for the door, my only thought to escape the impossible sound invading my apartment. But as my hand closed around the doorknob, it turned ice cold against my palm, so cold it burned. I jerked away with a cry of pain, cradling my hand against my chest. The clacking sound grew louder, more insistent. Clack, 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 clack. It moved from the kitchen into the hallway, approaching my bedroom where I stood paralyzed by fear. My phone. I needed to call someone, anyone. But when I grabbed it from the nightstand, the screen remained dark and unresponsive. Dead, despite having been fully charged moments before. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath clouded in front of my face as the clacking sound stopped just outside my bedroom door. In the silence that followed, I could hear the creaking of wood under strain and the jingle of metal, the same sounds I'd heard from the street, now impossibly close. Then came the voice, that hollow, distant voice I'd heard the night before. But this time, it wasn't unintelligible. This time, I could make out words spoken in archaic English with a pronounced accent. Who watches from the window? Who disturbs my passage? I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. My entire body trembled with a fear so profound it bordered on reverence. The door handle turned slowly, metal scraping against metal. I braced myself for whatever horror might appear, but the door merely opened onto the dark hallway beyond. Empty darkness that somehow felt occupied, filled with an unseen presence. Step forth, watcher. Show thyself. My legs moved of their own accord, drawn forward by some compulsion I couldn't resist. One step, then another, until I stood in the doorway facing the darkness of my hallway. In that darkness, something shifted. Not a visible movement, but a disturbance in the air itself, a rippling, as if reality were a pond and something had dropped a stone into its center. The air shimmered, solidified, then shimmered again. And for the briefest moment, I saw him. A man in colonial-era clothing, a midnight blue coat with tarnished silver buttons, mud-spattered riding boots, and a tricorn hat pulled low over his face. He was translucent, like a reflection in dark glass, but unmistakably there. In his gloved hand, he held what appeared to be a leather dispatch case, marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. His face, what little I could see of it beneath the hat, was gaunt and gray, with sunken eyes that burned with an unnatural intensity. Those eyes fixed on me with a gaze that felt physical, like cold fingers pressing against my skin. You see me, he said, wonder and rage mingling in his hollow voice. After all these years, you truly see me. I managed to find my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Who are you? I am the king's messenger. I ride with urgent dispatches for General Howe. His form flickered, becoming more solid for a moment before fading again. The rebels must not delay me again. I must complete my journey. General Howe? My mind raced through what little I remembered of Revolutionary War history. But that was almost 250 years ago. The figures seemed confused, his form wavering like smoke in a breeze. Nonsense. It is the year of our Lord 1776. The rebellion must be crushed before spring. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold air. This wasn't just a ghost, this was a man trapped in time, endlessly repeating a journey that had ended centuries ago. The war is over, I said gently, surprising myself with my own calm. It has been over for a very long time. The messenger's form flickered violently, his expression contorting with rage and disbelief. Lies. Rebel lies. He advanced toward me, one hand reaching out. You seek to delay me as they did. To lead me astray. I backed away, fear returning in a crushing wave. I'm not trying to delay you. I'm trying to help you understand. There is nothing to understand. His voice rose to a howl that seemed to shake the very walls. I must deliver my dispatches. The future of the colonies depends upon it. As he moved forward, his form became more solid with each step. The air around him crackled with energy, and behind him, impossibly, I could see the outline of my hallway beginning to change, the modern walls giving way to rough-hewn wooden beams, the laminate flooring transforming into worn planks. With horrifying clarity, I understood what Thomas had meant about the barriers becoming porous. This wasn't just a ghost manifesting in my world, this was his world bleeding into mine, reality itself reshaping around his perception. I had to stop it. Had to break whatever connection had formed between us, between our times. The dispatches, I said suddenly, an idea forming. What happened to them? Did you deliver them? The messenger halted, confusion once again crossing his spectral features. I was riding. There was rain. The cobblestones were slick. His hand went to his side, where I now noticed a dark stain spreading across his coat. They came from the shadows. Patriots. Traitors. They attacked my carriage. You were injured, I said, understanding dawning. You were killed before you could complete your mission. No, he roared, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I must deliver the dispatches. I must. He looked down at the leather case in his hand, then at the spreading stain on his coat. I must. The realization was spreading across his face, the dawning horror of his own death, over 2 centuries past. Your mission failed, I said, my voice stronger now. The colonies won their independence. America became its own nation. Your time is gone. My time. He repeated, his form flickering more rapidly now. Dawn? The walls of my hallway shimmered again, modern reality reasserting itself as his certainty wavered. I pressed my advantage. You need to move on. Let go of the dispatches. Let go of your mission. It's over. For a moment, he looked utterly lost, a man out of time, faced with the futility of his eternal journey. Then his expression hardened. If my time is truly past, then what remains for me? He demanded. If not my duty, then what purpose? I had no answer for that. What could I possibly say to a ghost confronting the meaninglessness of his endless haunting? In my silence, he seemed to come to a decision. He straightened, assuming once more the formal bearing of a king's messenger. Then I shall make a new purpose, he declared. If I cannot change the past, perhaps I can still influence the future. Before I could respond, he thrust the dispatch case toward me. It shouldn't have been possible, this interaction between solid flesh and spectral form, but the case felt real in my hands, cold leather that seemed to pulse with its own energy. Take it, the messenger commanded. Become my successor. carry what I could not. The case grew heavier in my hands, impossibly heavy, as if it contained far more than mere papers. The leather felt alive against my skin, and a seam along its edge began to glow with the same blue light I'd seen in the cobblestones. I tried to drop it, but my fingers wouldn't obey. The case seemed to be melting with my hands, becoming part of me. No! I cried, panic rising. I don't want this. The choice is not yours to make, the messenger said, his form beginning to fade. Asterisk, as it was not mine. We are but links in a chain, you and I, bearers of messages across the boundaries of time. The case had fused completely with my hands now, its leather texture merging with my skin. The blue glow spread up my arms like luminescent veins, pulsing in rhythm with my terrified heartbeat. What's happening to me? I gasped, watching in horror as the strange light continued its progress up my body. You are becoming as I am, the messenger said, his form now barely visible, a whisper of mist in the darkness. Neither fully here nor there. Neither fully then nor now. Understanding crashed over me like a wave of ice water. He wasn't passing on his mission, he was passing on his curse. His imprisonment between worlds. With a surge of desperate strength, I fought against the spreading transformation. I focused every ounce of my will on my hands, imagining them as mine alone, rejecting the foreign presence trying to claim them. This is not my burden to bear. I shouted into the darkness. Your time has passed. Your mission is over. Your king lost this land centuries ago. The messenger's face contorted with rage once more, but there was fear there too, fear that I might succeed where he had failed, that I might break free of the trap that had held him for so long. You cannot escape, he hissed. Once marked, always bound. Marked, I repeated, remembering Thomas's words. The Watchers. Those who had been marked. And suddenly I understood. Thomas, Dorothy, Jack, they hadn't just seen the carriage. They'd been chosen as potential replacements. Potential successors to carry on the endless, futile mission. The blue light had reached my chest now, each pulse sending waves of numbing cold through my body. I could feel myself becoming less substantial, my connection to the physical world beginning to fray. In desperation, I looked around for anything that might help me. My gaze fell on the window from which I had watched the cobblestone street below. The window that had allowed the messenger to notice me. With the last of my strength, I lunged toward it, dragging my increasingly numb body across the room. The messenger realized my intent too late. No, he cried, his form surging forward. You cannot break the cycle. But I was already there, my hands, now barely recognizable as human, smashing against the glass. The window shattered with a sound like breaking ice, razor-sharp shards cascading down to the street below. Cold night air rushed in, clearing the fog that had been gathering in my mind. I could see the cobblestones below, still faintly glowing with that unnatural blue light. I reject your mission, I said, my voice stronger now. I reject your time. I choose my own. The blue light covering my body flared painfully bright, then began to recede, flowing like water down my arms and back into the dispatch case. The leather separated from my skin, becoming solid and distinct once more. The messenger howled in rage and disappointment, his form flickering wildly between visibility and nothingness. You cannot escape what you have seen, he warned, his voice fading. The stones remember. They always remember. With a final surge of will, I lifted the dispatch case and hurled it through the broken window. It tumbled through the air, spinning end over end, the blue light trailing behind it like a comet's tail. When it struck the cobblestones below, there was a blinding flash. The glow from the stones intensified for a heartbeat, then disappeared entirely, plunging the street into ordinary darkness. The messenger let out a final, despairing cry before his form dissolved completely, leaving me alone in my apartment with the cold night wind blowing through the broken window. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted beyond measure. My body felt heavy again, solid, firmly anchored in the present. The impossible cold had receded, leaving only the ordinary chill of a spring night. I don't know how long I lay there before a pounding on my door jolted me back to full awareness. "Hello? Are you all right in there?" A woman's voice, concerned and slightly frightened. I heard glass breaking. Shakily, I got to my feet and made my way to the door. My neighbor, a young nurse who worked night shifts, stood in the hallway in her scrubs, looking worried. "I'm fine," I managed to say. "Just broke a window by accident. I'll clean it up." She didn't look convinced, but nodded reluctantly. "Do you need any help?" "No, thank you. I've got it." After she left, I approached the broken window cautiously. The street below appeared normal, the cobblestones just ordinary stones glistening under the street lamps. No sign remained of the dispatch case or the unearthly blue glow. Across the street, Thomas's window was dark and empty. I spent the remainder of the night in a state of exhausted vigilance, jumping at every creak and groan of my old apartment building. But no ghostly sounds disturbed the peace, no phantom carriage rolled by on the cobblestones below. When dawn finally came, I made my way downstairs and out onto the street, scanning the area where the dispatch case had fallen. There was nothing there, of course. No physical evidence of the night's events remained. But as I turned to go back inside, something caught my eye, a small, rectangular worn patch in one of the cobblestones. I knelt down to examine it, my fingers tracing what appeared to be the faint impression of a leather case, as if the stone had briefly softened like clay to receive the imprint before hardening again. "I told you they remember." I looked up to find Thomas standing a few feet away, leaning on his cane. He looked older than he had the day before, more frail, but there was a light in his eyes I hadn't seen before. "You broke the cycle," he said with quiet amazement. "All these years, and you found a way to break it. Is it over?" I asked. "Truly over?" Thomas studied the cobblestones thoughtfully. "For him, perhaps. For that particular ghost." He looked up at me, his expression grave but not without hope. "But the stones remain. And they've been here for centuries, witnessing far more than one messenger's tragic journey." I understood the implication of his words. The midnight coachman might be gone, but the cobblestones of Old Eastwick held many more memories, many more echoes of times long past. "What happens now?" I asked. Thomas smiled faintly. Now you decide. Do you run from what you've seen, what you now know about the thin places between then and now? Or do you stay and learn more? I looked down at the cobblestones beneath my feet, ordinary stones that had been trod by generations of feet that had witnessed the birth of a nation and all the years that followed. Stones that remembered in their silent, patient way. "I stay," I said finally. "I need to understand." Thomas nodded as if he had expected nothing less. "Then welcome to the Watchers," he said, extending his hand. "There are more of us than I thought." I took his hand, sealing a pact that I didn't fully understand but somehow knew would change my life forever. As we walked away from my building, I glanced back one last time at the cobblestones of Old Eastwick. In the bright morning sunlight, they looked perfectly ordinary. But I knew better now. Beneath our feet, the past wasn't really past. It was merely waiting for the right moment, the right observer, to rise once more to the surface. And somewhere in the distance, if I listened very carefully, I could just make out the faint sound of hooves on cobblestones. Clack, 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 clack. Have you ever noticed how some windows seem to watch you back? The realtor's smile never reached her eyes as she showed me through the apartment. It's quite a steal for this neighborhood, Mr. Walsh. 14 floors up, southern exposure, pre-war details. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floors, echoing in the empty space. The previous tenant left rather suddenly, but everything's been thoroughly cleaned and inspected. I nodded, distracted by the view of Manhattan spread out before me. After 6 months of crashing on friends' couches following my divorce, this place felt like salvation. Why is the rent so reasonable? I asked, running my fingers along the vintage crown molding. She hesitated, just a fraction too long. Market fluctuations. The building manager is eager to fill the vacancy. Something in her tone made me turn. She was standing with her back deliberately turned to the far corner of the living room. Following her gaze, I noticed a door slightly narrower than the others, its paint newer. "What's in there?" I asked. "Just a small spare room. Could make a nice office." She didn't move toward it. When I reached for the doorknob, the brass felt unusually cold against my palm. The door swung open with a soft whisper of resistance. The room beyond was ordinary enough, perhaps 10 feet square, walls painted a faded blue. Empty except for built-in bookshelves and a radiator beneath the window. But something felt off. Despite the August heat wave gripping the city, my breath clouded in front of my face. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees just by stepping through the doorway. "Excellent insulation," the realtor said weakly. "Very energy efficient." I moved toward the window, drawn by something I couldn't name. The glass appeared normal at first glance, but as I drew closer, I noticed a delicate pattern of frost spreading across its inner surface. Tiny crystalline formations, like miniature ferns, spiraled outward from the center. "Is there something wrong with the window?" I asked, reaching out to touch it. "Don't." The sharpness in her voice made me flinch. She composed herself quickly. "Sorry, just that the super mentioned it needs to be resealed. Nothing major." I pulled my hand back. The frost seemed to pulse slightly, as if responding to my proximity. The previous tenant, why did they leave suddenly? I asked, unable to tear my eyes from the strangely beautiful patterns forming on the glass. "Career opportunity in another state," she answered too quickly. "Very last minute." As I turned to face her, something caught my ear, a soft sound, barely perceptible. Like fingernails dragging gently across the other side of the glass. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. The realtor was already backing toward the door. Traffic noise. These old buildings, they carry sound in strange ways. I pressed my ear closer to the window. The scratching stopped, replaced by something else, a muffled tapping, rhythmic and deliberate. 3 quick taps, followed by 3 slow ones. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to peer through the frost. But all I could see was a distorted reflection of myself, the ice making my features appear stretched and unfamiliar. "Mr. Walsh, we should really finish the tour. There's still the kitchen to see, granite countertops, all new appliances." I reluctantly followed her out, but not before noticing something strange. Though the window faced south, supposedly getting direct sunlight, the area outside appeared dark, as if perpetually in shadow. As she closed the door behind us, I could have sworn I heard a sigh from within the room, a long exhalation of frigid air. "I'll take it," I said, surprising myself. The realtor blinked rapidly. "Don't you want to see the rest of the apartment?" "No need. It's perfect." Something was pulling me toward this place, toward that room. Later, as I signed the lease in the building manager's office, an elderly man mopping the hallway paused by the door. "You're taking 12F?" he asked, leaning on his mop. I nodded. He crossed himself quickly. "Just some advice. Keep that inside room locked at night, especially when it gets cold." The building manager shot him a warning look. "Miguel, that's enough." "Why?" I asked. "What happens when it gets cold?" Miguel's weathered face tightened. "The tapping gets louder. And sometimes it sounds like words." As I rode the elevator back up to what would now be my apartment, I told myself the old man was just trying to scare me. But I couldn't shake the memory of that frost-covered window, somehow freezing despite the summer heat outside. And I couldn't forget the rhythm of those taps against the glass, like a code, like someone trying desperately to communicate, like someone trying to get out. The first week in apartment 12F passed uneventfully enough. I established my new routine: coffee on the small balcony watching sunrise over the East River, remote work during the day, take-out dinners eaten while watching the city lights emerge at dusk. I kept the door to the spare room closed. Not locked, I wasn't that superstitious, but firmly shut. Occasionally, I'd press my palm against its surface, feeling an unnatural coolness seeping through the wood. My neighbors were the typical New York mix: a middle-aged couple who argued in Russian down the hall, a group of graduate students above whose footsteps tracked back and forth late into the night, an elderly woman with a wheezing pug on my floor who nodded silently when we passed in the hallway. None of them met my eyes for more than a second. None of them asked why I'd moved into 12F. On the 8th night, I awoke at 3:17 according to my bedside clock, the air in my bedroom unnaturally still. Something had changed in the apartment's atmosphere, a subtle difference in pressure, as if the air itself had become denser. I lay motionless, listening. The usual city sounds filtered up from below: an occasional car horn, the distant wail of a siren, the steady mechanical hum that is New York's perpetual heartbeat. But underneath it all was something else, a soft, rhythmic noise coming from within my apartment. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. 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 The same pattern I heard that first day. 3 quick taps followed by 3 slow ones. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my bare feet flinching at the unexpected coldness of the hardwood floor. The temperature had dropped dramatically, though the radiator was hissing with heat. The tapping stopped the moment I stood up. I moved through the darkened apartment, navigating by the ambient city glow seeping through the windows. When I reached the spare room door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, turning the handle. The door didn't budge. I tried again, twisting harder, but it remained firmly shut, locked, though I knew there was no lock on this door. Pressing my ear against the wood, I listened. At first, only silence. Then, so faint I might have imagined it, what sounded like movement, something sliding across the floor, a soft scraping. And breathing. Shallow, ragged breathing, like someone trying to remain silent but unable to control their desperate need for air. "Hello?" I called, feeling immediately foolish. "Is someone in there?" The breathing stopped abruptly. Then, directly on the other side of the door, so close it could only be inches away, came a voice, barely above a whisper, high and childlike. "Cold," it said. Just that one word, exhaled more than spoken. I stumbled backward, heart hammering against my ribs. "Who are you?" I demanded, sounding braver than I felt. "How did you get in there?" Only silence answered me. I retreated to the kitchen, flipping on every light switch I passed. Under the harsh fluorescence, I searched through drawers until I found a screwdriver. Returning to the door, I worked at the hinges, determined to get it open. The metal screws were covered with frost. My fingers burned with cold as I tried to turn them, becoming numb after just seconds of contact. After 10 minutes of struggling, the doorknob suddenly turned on its own. The door swung inward silently. The room beyond was empty, exactly as I'd left it. Except for the window. The frost had spread, covering not just the glass, but creeping onto the surrounding wall. Delicate ice crystals formed intricate patterns, almost like writing in some ancient, unknowable script. And in the center of the window, clearly visible in the frost, was the perfect outline of a small handprint. I approached cautiously, my own breath now visible in the freezing air. The handprint was too small to be an adult's, perhaps belonging to a child of 8 or 9. I raised my own hand, hovering in inches from the ghostly impression on the glass. The cold intensified, burning my skin without touching it. Behind me, the door slammed shut. I spun around, lunging for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. Trapped, I pounded on the wooden surface, calling for help though I knew no one would hear. From beyond the door came the sound of soft laughter, the same childlike voice that had whispered cold. I turned back to the window, desperate now. The frost was spreading rapidly across the walls, crackling as it advanced. The temperature plummeted until each breath was painful in my lungs. The tapping began again, but this time from my side of the window. I watched in horror as the handprint in the frost began to move, its fingertips drumming against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap. 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 A message. It was trying to communicate. "What do you want?" I whispered, my lips stiff with cold. The frost shifted, letters appearing as if traced by invisible fingers. HELPME. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the cold receded. The door clicked open behind me. The frost retreated, melting away until only the window bore any trace, a thin circle of ice around its edges. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me. The rest of the night I spent huddled on my couch, lights blazing, until dawn broke over the city. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by the move, the divorce, the loneliness of my new life. But when I finally gathered the courage to open the spare room door again, the window was completely clear. Not a trace of frost remained, except for a single, perfect handprint centered exactly where I'd seen it in the night. And underneath it, condensation had formed 2 simple words on the glass. "Find me." I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? A frozen window in August. A child's handprint appearing and disappearing. Messages written in frost. Instead, I began researching the building's history. Constructed in 1934, the Morgan residence had stood through depressions, wars, and the city's various transformations. Archives from the local newspaper mentioned nothing unusual, no tragic accidents, no mysterious disappearances. Nothing to explain what was happening in that room. I avoided entering it during the day, but each night the tapping would begin around 3:17. Sometimes I'd ignore it, burying my head under pillows until dawn. Other times, driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I'd press my ear against the door, listening to the rhythm change and shift like some cryptic code. By the second week, I started to understand patterns in the tapping. It wasn't random, it followed the cadence of language. I brought home a book on Morse code, staying up late transcribing what I heard. Help. Cold. Find me. The same words, repeated nightly. On the 15th day, I encountered Miguel in the hallway again. "You're still here," he said, genuine surprise in his voice. "Most don't last a week." I glanced around to ensure we were alone. "The room with the window, what do you know about it?" His eyes widened. "You've heard it, then." "The tapping." "And more," I admitted. "There's something, someone." He pulled me toward the stairwell, away from potential listeners. "It started 4 years ago," he whispered. "After the renovation. They converted the building from offices to apartments. That room in 12F, it wasn't supposed to be there." "What do you mean?" "The original blueprints don't show it. When they rebuilt the interior, they discovered that space, sealed off, hidden behind a wall for decades. No entrance, no record of it ever being used. Just an empty room with that window." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. Has anyone else seen what I've seen? The frost, the handprint. Miguel crossed himself again. "There was one tenant, before you. Eleanor Patterson, a professor from NYU. She became obsessed with the room. Started spending all her time in there, taking notes, recording the sounds." "What happened to her?" His voice dropped even lower. "She disappeared. Just vanished one winter night. Left everything behind, clothes, papers, her research. The police investigated, but there was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. It was as if she just walked out of her life." "Or into somewhere else," I murmured, thinking of the window and its impossible frost. Miguel gripped my arm with surprising strength. "Listen to me. Whatever is in that room, it wants something. It's been waiting. Don't give it what it wants." Before I could ask what he meant, the elevator dinged and the building manager stepped out. His eyes narrowed when he saw us together. "Miguel, don't you have work to do on the 7th floor?" he asked pointedly. The old man released my arm, nodding subserviently before shuffling away. That night, I did something I hadn't done before. I entered the spare room before the tapping began, setting up a chair facing the window. The temperature was normal, the glass clear and ordinary in the city's evening glow. I placed a digital thermometer on the windowsill and waited. At exactly 3:17, the temperature began to drop. First gradually, 72 degrees, 65, 50, then precipitously. Within minutes, the readout showed 28 degrees and falling. The frost appeared from the center of the window, spreading outward in fractal patterns of extraordinary complexity. Beautiful and terrifying simultaneously. My breath clouded before me as I whispered, "Who are you?" The frost swirled, forming letters, Ellie. "Ellie," I repeated. "Is that short for Eleanor?" "Eleanor Patterson?" The frost cleared momentarily, then formed new words. "No." "Before her." My hands trembled, partly from cold, partly from fear. "How long have you been here, Ellie?" "Long. Cold. So cold." The handprint appeared again, pressing against the glass from the inside. Small fingers splayed, palm flat, a child's desperate reach for contact. Acting on instinct, I raised my own hand, placing it against the window, aligning my much larger palm with the tiny imprint in the frost. The cold burned against my skin, but I didn't pull away. The glass between our hands seemed to thin, to become permeable. I could feel, impossibly, terrifyingly, the pressure of small fingers pushing back against mine. And then, for just a moment, I saw her. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. A small girl with pale blonde hair and eyes so blue they were almost white, wearing what looked like a nightgown from another era. Her face was gaunt, her lips blue with cold. She stood on the other side of the window, in a space that couldn't possibly exist, 14 floors up, where there should be nothing but open air. Behind her stretched darkness, punctuated by swirling snow and distant, floating lights. "How do I help you?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Find me," the frost wrote. "Then, follow the cold." Follow it where? I don't understand. The girl's image flickered, her expression turning from pleading to warning. She glanced over her shoulder, as if hearing something approach, something I couldn't perceive. "Careful," the frost spelled rapidly. "Not alone here." The handprint pulled away from the glass. In its place, frost formed a new pattern, a map of what I recognized as the building's layout, with a small X marking what must be the basement. Then, the temperature plummeted so rapidly that the thermometer simply displayed an error message. The cold became a physical presence, pressing against me from all sides. The window began to crack, hairline fractures spreading from the center outward. Not breaking, but changing, transforming into something that was neither glass nor ice, but something in between. A threshold. Behind the glass, the darkness shifted. The small figure of the girl retreated, swallowed by shadows. And something else moved forward to take her place, a taller form, indistinct but unmistakably adult. The tapping changed, becoming heavier, more insistent. No longer a child's fingers, but a fist, pounding with increasing force. The pattern was different too, no longer a plea for help, but something threatening, demanding. I stumbled backward as the window bulged inward slightly, glass groaning under impossible pressure. The frost letters shifted, forming a single word. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I fled the room, slamming the door behind me just as the window shattered inward, sending shards of freezing glass across the floor. Cold air rushed through the apartment like a cyclone, carrying with it the sound of something moving, something crawling through the broken window into my home. I grabbed my phone and keys, not bothering with shoes or a jacket, and ran for the hallway. As I pulled the apartment door closed behind me, I heard it, a voice that was nothing like the child's whisper, deep and grating like ice shifting across stone. Finally, it said, "A way out." I fled down 14 flights of stairs, too terrified to wait for the elevator. My bare feet slapped against the concrete steps, each impact sending jolts of pain up my legs, but I couldn't slow down. Couldn't risk being followed by whatever had come through that window. The lobby was deserted at this hour, almost 4 in the morning now. The security desk stood empty. Miguel had mentioned budget cuts meant no overnight guard on weekdays. I had nowhere to go. The doors to the street were locked from the inside, requiring a key card I'd left upstairs in my panic. The thought of returning to my apartment sent a wave of nausea through me. Then I remembered the map in the frost. The X in the basement. Find me. Follow the cold. The basement access door was beside the elevator bank, marked staff only. I tried the handle, locked. Desperation made me reckless. I grabbed a fire extinguisher from its wall mount and smashed the handle until the cheap lock gave way. The stairwell beyond was poorly lit, bare bulbs casting harsh shadows on concrete walls. The air grew noticeably colder as I descended, my breath becoming visible by the time I reached the bottom. The basement was a maze of utility rooms, storage cages, and maintenance areas. I moved through it slowly, guided only by the increasing cold, following it as Ellie had instructed. In the farthest corner, past the boiler room and electrical panels, I found a door unlike the others. Heavy metal, pitted with age, with a rusted padlock securing it. The air around it was frigid, frost forming on the walls nearby. This had to be it. I searched frantically for something to break the lock, finally finding a length of pipe in a nearby maintenance rack. It took several swings before the ancient padlock shattered. The door swung open with surprising ease, revealing not a room but a narrow tunnel, an old service passage, perhaps, or part of the city's underground infrastructure that had been incorporated into the building's foundation. I hesitated at the threshold. The tunnel stretched into darkness, the air flowing from it so cold it burned my lungs. Logic screamed at me to turn back, to flee the building, to call the police, though what would I tell them? Instead, I took out my phone, activating its flashlight. The battery indicator immediately dropped from 60% to 20%, affected by the extreme cold. "Ellie?" I called, my voice echoing down the passageway. "Are you here?" No response came, but the cold intensified, as if in acknowledgement. I stepped into the tunnel. The walls were a mixture of ancient brick and newer concrete, suggesting the passage had been modified over the decades. Water seeping through the masonry had frozen into glittering rivulets of ice. I walked for what seemed like hundreds of yards, though it was impossible to judge distance in the disorienting chill and darkness. My extremities grew numb, my movements becoming clumsy as hypothermia set in. The tunnel finally opened into a circular chamber. My weakening flashlight revealed walls covered in strange markings, not graffiti, but carefully carved symbols reminiscent of those I'd seen in the frost patterns on the window. In the center of the room stood what appeared to be a well, a circular stone structure rising about 3 feet from the floor, its opening covered by a heavy iron grate. Frost covered everything, thicker here than anywhere else. The air temperature must have been well below zero. I approached the well, my movements sluggish with cold. The iron grate was elaborately designed, depicting scenes I couldn't fully comprehend, figures falling through darkness, hands reaching upward, faces contorted in silent screams. And there, etched into the metal at the very center, was a small handprint, identical to the one on my window. My phone's light flickered and died, plunging me into total darkness. But I could still see the handprint, glowing with a faint blue luminescence. I knelt beside the well, placing my palm against the metal handprint just as I had done with the one on the window. The contact sent a shock of cold so intense it felt like fire. I tried to pull away but couldn't, my hand was frozen to the surface. In that moment of connection, I heard her voice clearly, no longer muffled by glass or distance. "You found me." The words carried both gratitude and sorrow. "Ellie," I gasped, my voice weak from the cold. "What is this place? What happened to you?" A shimmer of light rose from the well, not from within it, but from the metal itself, coalescing into the ghostly image of the girl I had seen through the window. "They built this building on top of something older," she said, her voice oddly adult despite her childlike appearance. "Something that was meant to stay sealed. The well goes down to a place that isn't here. A cold place. A hungry place. How did you? I couldn't finish, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I lived in this building when it was new. 1935. My father was the caretaker. Her form flickered like a candle flame. I found the passage. Found the well. I was curious. She gestured to the handprint. They used children to seal it. Our handprints. Our essence. But it wasn't enough. It wants more. It's always hungry for warmth. What wants more? I managed to ask. The cold itself. The thing that lives in it. Her expression turned desperate. It took me. It's been holding me all this time, between places. Not alive, not dead. Just cold. So cold. I understood now. And Eleanor Patterson? The professor who disappeared? Ellie's form dimmed slightly. She found me too. Tried to help. But she didn't understand what she was dealing with. It took her. It wears her now, like a coat, to keep warm. To move in your world. Horror washed over me as I realized what had come through my window. Not Ellie. Something else, something wearing Eleanor Patterson like a disguise. It's in the building, I said. It came through the window. No, Ellie whispered, her form beginning to fade. Not just in the building. It's here. It followed you. The temperature, already unbearable, dropped further. Ice crystals formed in the air itself, hanging suspended like tiny diamonds. You need to replace the seal, Ellie said urgently. Close the way between worlds. How? I asked, my consciousness fading as the cold overwhelmed me. Blood and intention. That's how they made the original seal. That's what it's been trying to break all these years. Behind me, something moved in the darkness. Heavy footsteps, dragging slightly, approached from the tunnel. It can't cross the well's threshold without help, Ellie said. That's why it needed someone to find me, to break the old seal. It's been calling to people for decades, but only Eleanor heard, until you. The footsteps stopped at the entrance to the chamber. I couldn't turn to look, my hands still frozen to the grate, my body nearly immobile with cold. Little Ellie, came a voice, the same grating, inhuman voice I'd heard in my apartment, but now overlaid with feminine tones that must have belonged to Eleanor Patterson. Still trying to keep me contained after all these years? Ellie's form contracted in fear. It can't have your world, she told me. The cold would never end. The presence moved closer, and with it came a cold so profound it transcended physical sensation, becoming a kind of anti-light that consumed rather than illuminated. Just let go, the voice coaxed. Let go and the cold will end for you. You'll be warm again. My vision darkened at the edges, consciousness slipping away. It would be so easy to surrender, to end the pain of this freezing hell. But Ellie's ghostly hand covered mine where it pressed against the grate. Please, she begged. Help me finish this. With my last reserves of strength, I pulled at the grate. My skin tore, blood welling from my palm and dripping onto the ancient metal. No, screamed the voice behind me. The blood spread across the grate, filling the edge patterns, flowing toward the central handprint. Where it touched, the metal began to glow with the same blue light as Ellie's form. Thank you, she whispered as the light intensified. Now run. The grate suddenly released my hand, and I stumbled backward. The entity that had been pursuing me, a shadow wearing the vague shape of a woman, lunged forward, but stopped short of the well as if hitting an invisible barrier. It screamed in frustration, the sound causing the ice on the walls to crack and shatter. I didn't wait to see more. I ran, numb legs somehow carrying me back through the tunnel, away from the well and its guardian and the thing trapped with them. Behind me, the blue light flared brilliantly, then dimmed, leaving only darkness and a silence deeper than any I had ever known. I don't remember much about my escape from the basement. My memories are fragments, stumbling through the tunnel, the cold receding with each step, emerging into the building's lobby as dawn broke over the city, the shocked face of the morning doorman seeing me, barefoot, frostbitten, my hand bleeding. They took me to the hospital, where doctors marveled at the severity of my hypothermia. "Like you fell through ice," one resident commented. In August, I told them I had sleepwalked into the building's walk-in freezer. They didn't believe me, but it was more plausible than the truth. 3 days later, I was discharged with bandaged hands and a referral to a psychiatrist. I returned to the building only once, accompanied by a police officer, to collect essential belongings from apartment 12F. The spare room door stood open. Inside, the window was perfectly intact, no sign of the shattering I'd witnessed. But the glass was covered in a thick layer of frost, obscuring any view of the outside world. "Faulty seal," the officer commented. "You should report that to maintenance." I didn't tell him that the building manager had already visited, had already tried to remove the frost, had fled when his industrial heat gun froze solid in his hands. I didn't return to that apartment. Abandoned the lease, abandoned most of my possessions. Some things are worth going back for. But I couldn't abandon the questions. What had Ellie meant by blood and intention? What was the well truly sealing? And most troubling, what had happened to Eleanor Patterson's body if something else had been wearing it like a coat? I spent weeks searching through archives, public records, cult forums, anything that might explain what I'd experienced. The building's history revealed little, but city planning maps from the early 1900s showed something unexpected. Before the building existed, that exact location had been marked as a thermal anomaly, a spot where ground temperatures were inexplicably cold year-round. And older maps, from when the city was still New Amsterdam, labeled the area with a Dutch phrase that roughly translated to the cold that hungers. I found Eleanor Patterson's academic work, articles on folklore surrounding thin places where boundaries between worlds weakened. Her later publications grew increasingly frantic, less academic, describing personal experiences with a sentient cold attempting to cross into our world. Her colleagues had dismissed these as delusions brought on by stress. After her disappearance, most assumed suicide. 3 months after my experience, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about renovations at the Morgan residence, specifically the permanent sealing of a previously unknown basement area discovered during routine maintenance. Scrawled across the clipping in shaky handwriting were the words, "It holds for now." McGill, still standing guard in his way. I moved to Arizona after that, as far from New York's winters as I could get. The desert heat bakes into my bones during the day, but nights still bring a chill that wakes me at 3:17, my hand throbbing where it pressed against that ancient grate. Sometimes I dream of Ellie, still bound to her post at the well between worlds. In these dreams, she's both child and ancient guardian, watching the seal that keeps the cold at bay. Sometimes I dream of Eleanor Patterson, or whatever wears her face, testing that seal, searching for weaknesses, for another curious soul to manipulate. And sometimes, on the coldest desert nights, I wake to find my bedroom window rimed with frost from the inside, bearing the faint outline of a small handprint. Not a threat. A warning. Because the seal won't hold forever. Nothing does. And when it fails, the cold that hungers will reach for warmth again. It knows me now. It knows I'm listening. So I keep my windows locked, even in summer heat. I check the glass each morning for signs of frost. And most importantly, I never, ever answer when I hear tapping in the night. 3 quick taps, followed by 3 slow ones. A message from the cold. It's still trying to find a way through. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.